For all those who appreciate the work that we're doing here on Standing for Truth, please hit that subscribe button because we are just getting started.
Hey everyone, before we get going, let me just tell everyone who has no idea who we are, that we are a team called Standing for Truth, a small group of young earth creationists dedicated to spreading the truth at any cost. None of us were raised Christian, and we do not care about denominational differences between us whatsoever. We love science and search diligently for truth and follow it, no matter where it leads. I was raised like most of you, secular public school educated with only knowledge of evolution pumped into our heads. One day, my best friend showed me a video of Aron Ra's flood series, and we watched maybe one or two videos before we eventually stopped and jumped back into playing PlanetSide 2 for about the next 6 hours. But I will never forget it. It was Aron Ra's flood series that made him believe the Bible was nonsense, and was the reason that he was an atheist, believing that there is no way that Noah's flood could be true. One day, I finally took the time and sat back and took my knowledge of science and stacked it up against young earth creation and discovered that everything the evolutionary model explains, so does the young earth creation model, but better. It was at this point that I had no option but to go to where the evidence led. So when I eventually became a young earth creationist, I remembered that video my friend showed me. And the first thing I did was write a book debunking every single comment that Aron Ra made in these videos. I realized later that people really just don't like books anymore. They like videos much more. So now I am finally making this video, destroying Aron Ra's flood series with Standing for Truth, proving that Aron Ra failed miserably down the line in his entire flood series. So rather than make a 10-hour video refuting every single thing he says like in my book, let's just take the first argument that he makes in every single video from his flood series and break it down to show everyone he literally has no idea what he's talking about. Buckle up, everyone.
Sometimes getting into what is effectively my job now, I spend more time pretending to be learned than actually learning, and I would... Yeah.
From an archaeological perspective, the first problem with the fable of Noah's Ark and a worldwide flood is when that is supposed to have happened. Early in the 17th century, Archbishop James Ussher attempted to calculate the age of the earth down to the exact date of its creation, according to the Bible. He did this by adding the ages of biblical characters who begat other biblical characters to establish a genealogical timeline back to Adam. Then he added the previous days of the creation myth to the ultimate date of origin on Sunday, October 23rd, 4004 BC at 9 a.m. His calculations were left unchallenged for centuries, and the so-called young earth creationists have accepted his determination of the age of the earth being roughly 6,000 years old, regardless of all the evidence to the contrary. However, they reject his date for the flood.
The survey said
100% wrong right out the gate. First, most young earth creationists do accept a very close version of Ussher's chronology. You yourself even unwillingly admitted this in another video on your flood series. So is this ignorance, lying, or sheer stupidity? I don't know which is worse. Next,
Ussher dated the landing of Noah's Ark as the 5th of May in 1491 BCE.
the survey said
again, 100% wrong. Ussher's proposed date of the flood was specifically 2348 BC. So unlike what Aron says, the vast majority of all young earth creationists believe in Ussher's chronology in dating of the age of the earth and the flood, which he says did not happen at this time, but rather happened in 1491 BC.
Ussher dated the landing of Noah's Ark as the 5th of May in 1491 BCE.
This is when Ussher said the Exodus occurred, not the global flood. Ironically, Aron being so adamant that young Earth creationists reject Usher's date of the flood when he doesn't even know when Usher said the flood happened is beyond ironic to me. But, alas, I should say that I never gave up on Aron, and I kept trying to find where he got this information from. I was never able to find any source backing up Aron Ra's claim for Usher dating the flood at 1491 BC, and I challenge any critic listening, do the same. Just so you can see for yourself how fake of a guru this guy really is.
There's something like a flood geology consensus between Answers in Genesis and Institute for Creation Research that Pangea is what the world looked like right up until God hit the reset button. They think that the last 300 million years of continental drift happened all in 1 year, with more destructive force coming from tsunamis than from rainfall, and ocean basins deepening to collect all the water at the end. Now, when plate tectonics happens, the ocean crust gets subducted, dragged under the continent crust down into the Earth's mantle. And sometimes we can use geophysical techniques to peek down into the mantle and see remnants of a subducted oceanic plate. It's actually rare to get a good look because they only last so many tens of millions of years. But if flood geology is honest, then the mantle should be full of spent oceanic slabs, all in exactly the same condition. Structural geology is the field of study for how rock bodies behave under the stresses of burial, and it would be largely non-existent with flood tectonics.
This is standing for truth. Evidence for the Genesis flood is absolutely overwhelming. One of the predictions of flood geology, and more specifically, a prediction of catastrophic plate tectonics, is that if plates are being pushed down during the global flood, then they would not have had enough time to melt. Let's get right into this. For one, we know that the plates are moving. Okay, this is empirical. We can actually observe this. The continents are moving very slowly today, snail-paced movements. But can these snail-paced geological movements explain the geological features of the Earth today? The answer is no. I am sorry, uniformitarians, they cannot. When it comes to the flood model, we are no longer looking at continental drift. We are actually looking at continental sprint. We are looking at meters per second plate movements. I also want to point out the fact, the scope and scale of the energy produced during the Genesis flood would be profound. The fountains of the great deep break open, and the earth itself is fractured like an eggshell. We've got continents moving vertically. We've got them moving horizontally. Catastrophic plate tectonics actually predicts that the pre-flood ocean crust would be dragged down into the mantle in a process we all know of as subduction. This has happened according to the global flood model just a few thousand years ago. Therefore, we would predict that this cold ocean crust should still be cold today, even though it has actually just descended into the deep hot mantle. Modern seismologists have discovered that there are indeed huge cold slabs of rock down near the core itself in areas that should have warmed up if millions of years worth of time or what actually brought those slabs down instead of the global flood of Noah. Guys, this is a line of evidence that the uniformitarians and the critics are utterly incapable of dealing with. And trust me when I tell you I know, because I have personally experienced it. I've seen them try, and they have failed miserably. Thank you.
The world that surrounds us now is like a matrix regarding our origins and the history of life on Earth. Competing theories abound, and these theories change every generation. Our reality matrix comes to us through indoctrination from when we are really young, from watching television, movies, going to museums, and through the public education system. These concepts they instill into our minds undermine what Scripture says, so a young Christian is forced to assume that the Bible must be just a myth because they have no idea how to refute anything they are learning. A perfect example of this is Noah's flood, which has been replaced with the slow, long uniformitarianism ideas. This all came from Charles Lyell, a British lawyer who lived in England that invented the geologic column for one reason and one reason only. In his words, to rid the sciences of Moses. Clearly his agenda and not scientific discoveries were the reason for this. And to this day, his made-up ideas still plague school textbooks and museums as though they are fact, even though countless contradictions abound in the geologic column itself. And even to this day, catastrophism is not even allowed to be considered in evolutionary science class. Think about that. The Bible predicted this long ago.
Estimates are that there are roughly 5,000 species of mammals alive today, plus more than 10,000 species of reptiles, not including birds, of which there are another 10,000 species or so. Then there are another 7,600 amphibians, amounting to roughly 33,000, mostly terrestrial tetrapods altogether. That doesn't account for fish or insects with a vast majority of life on Earth, only the relative few that the biblical authors would recognize as having the breath of life. So the fable says that all the animals that had the breath of life would come to Noah to be saved from the flood. Thus, the first thought you might have is that Noah loaded 66,000 individual animals onto a box that couldn't possibly hold them all.
In 2014, a group of master students at Leicester University decided to settle the question. They used the biblical measurements to calculate the size of the ark. Then they used the density of the water to figure buoyancy, and from there determined how much weight the ship could endure before sinking. Their conclusion? Noah could have put 70,000 animals on board and the ship would have floated.
And what do you know? It floats!
Considering the amount of water currently in the oceans is about 1.37 billion cubic kilometers, then in order to cover all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens, would require an additional 4.4 billion cubic kilometers or a billion cubic miles of water. I have to convert the metrics since most of my target audience are Americans who don't understand science.
So the vast majority of your audience, meaning your fans, are Americans who you're making fun of. Bravo. Bravo.
So to flood the world the way the Bible said would take roughly 3 times the amount of water we already have. Where did all this extra water come from? And we know that it couldn't already be here because the land would still be covered now.
It's these type of statements that make me think he has either never looked at a single flood model at all, or he is just straight out lying about what he says. Because nearly every flood model says that the oceans we're looking at today are a remnant of the floodwaters that came out of the earth, including the icebergs, and that a good portion of the water receded back exactly like what's described in the Bible.
Shut up!
How did young Earth creationists decide that the universe was only 6,000 years old? A 17th century monk added up the obviously dubious ages of generations of fictional characters from his favorite folklore, and from that he determined that the world was magically created on October 23rd, 4004 BCE. But the leading propaganda mills of this type of resistance to reality do hold to a 6,021-year-old world, and they hold similarly specific dates for their mythic flood, too. Answers in Genesis said it happened in 2370 BCE. Institute for Creation Research said that it was in 2348 BCE, and Creation.com says it was 2304 BCE. And all these believers agree that according to the scriptures that they worship, their flood should have happened less than 4,387 years ago. We have trees older than that. This bristlecone pine, for example, was once famously hailed as the oldest living individual organism on Earth. At 4,765 years old, this tree would have been 300 or 400 years old at the start of Noah's flood. The way we know that is with dendrochronology, the study of tree rings. Trees in temperate zones follow an annual cycle of seasons where early spring growth is faster and thus the wood is a lighter color. But as growth slows down again in autumn, the wood is denser and thus darker, creating a sequence of one additional ring for each year of growth.
Those three organizations which you showed all read from the King James Version of the Bible, which all come from the Masoretic text. This is the only version of the Bible which has evidence that the ages of the post-flood patriarchs were altered. We can find in older texts, and in many other texts, even the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the ages are very different. And by adding back those ages, you push the flood back 5,320 years. Therefore, dendrochronology aligns with the global flood easily.
There's a difference of opinion in terms of the dates associated with the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. Can you explain that a little bit?
First, we go back to Genesis 11. And within Genesis 11, we have one of the genealogies. Basically gives us the history of the transmission of people going from the time of the flood down to Abraham. And in that genealogy, we have various readings in the text. We have different Hebrew traditions, different written traditions of the Bible, even beyond the Hebrew Bible, that give us information that would cause us to understand maybe one or another is problematic. There are two other textual traditions apart from the Masoretic text, and those are independent traditions, and they're found in the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, known as the LXX, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And in those texts, the numbers are different. When you study the issue, you see that there's basically two textual traditions there. The Masoretic tradition and what we call a double textual tradition of the Samaritan Pentateuch, which is an older form of the Hebrew Bible, and the LXX or Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So these two textual traditions match up together in contrast to what we read in the Genesis 11 account in the Masoretic text. Basically what it comes down to is this: with a number of the men who are the fathers, the ones who sire children who are part of this genealogy, there's a difference in how old that man was at the time that he birthed that child who was part of that genealogy. So, for example, if a father in the Masoretic text was 30 years old when he sired that child, in the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, it says that he was 130 years old. So you have this same type of repeated problem in the textual tradition. Now, what's interesting is that when you come to the end of that lifespan of that certain patriarch, he lives the exact same amount of time in the Masoretic text versus the double tradition of the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint. So the question is, which tradition is correct and which is incorrect? Now, I wrote my Master of Theology thesis in the area of lower textual criticism, which essentially is the study of what did the text of the Bible in the original manuscripts say, whether in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek. We have a number of principles that we use in the field of textual criticism. These are called canons. And the most important, and this is universally recognized as the most important canon for determining correct readings, is this: choose the reading that best accounts for the other readings. Now, what that comes down to is the correct reading is going to account for how you develop the spurious reading. So if you were a Masoretic scribe and you saw that the man was 30 years old when he sired his child, is there any reason that would make you change your text in hopes that you're improving it to alter the number to 130 years of age when he sired that child?
I can't think of any.
Right. So we can account for the reading in the Masoretic text by changing it from 130 to 30. That's very logical. It's absolutely illogical to change the text from 30 years of age to 130 years of age. And in this textual tradition, we have two independent lines of textual tradition that both bear with them the same numbering. So most likely, although the Masoretic text on the whole more often is correct than the other textual lines or textual sources with the Hebrew Bible, in this case, almost certainly the Masoretic text itself is wrong.
Yeah.
Before we can talk about how anthropology disproves Noah's flood, I'm going to have to explain a few things about human evolution that you likely wouldn't know unless this is a subject that you're passionate about. The various species of humans within the genus Homo evidently evolved from Australopiths. Our closest known ancestral archetype is Australopithecus afarensis, also known as Lucy, although she was just the first of hundreds of her species to be discovered. So when I say Lucy, I'm referring to the whole species and not any one individual. The media did the same thing with Ardipithecus. Artie was older than Lucy, so headlines proclaimed that Lucy wasn't our ancestor anymore because journalists don't understand paleoanthropology and sensationalism is what sells the news. So let me set this straight. Lucy is roughly 3.2 million years old. Artie is more than 1 million years older than Lucy, and this new one from Greece is millions of years older than Artie. Artie's descendants may have led to multiple branches, only one of which include Lucy. Lucy's lineage led to multiple branches, only one of which include humans.
The survey said...
Aron Ra looks to the fossil record, but the fossil record is no help to Aron Ra. The further we go back in the fossil record, we actually run into what is called the Cambrian explosion, where we have all this phyla suddenly appear out of nowhere. We have jellyfish, coral, trilobites, these greatly different organisms, these different body types, all highly complex structures, and yet no evidence for this assumed evolution. This is the opposite of what Darwin expected. If we have a phylum level event, there must have been astronomical numbers of evolutionary experiments in order to evolve such amazing complexity and features. The evidence isn't there, Aron Ra. The evidence does not support universal common ancestry. The fossil record does not help Aron Ra. Genetics does not help Aron Ra. Genetics confirms separate ancestry. We see boundaries. We see boundaries in both the fossil record and genetics. This is all confirmation of independent origins. As a matter of fact, if we were to just focus in on humans in the fossil record, we see no evidence of hundreds of thousands of years of human existence. Sorry, Aron Ra. Given the evolutionary model that Aron Ra holds to, we can assume there were about 1 million Homo erectus living across Eurasia, Africa, and essentially handling a massive distribution. Now, let us say their average generation time is 20 years. That means about every 20 years you have another 1 million dead bodies. And so after 1 million years, we have over 20 billion dead people. This is 20 billion people of which we have no evidence ever existed. Even the proponents of evolution like Aron Ra would agree that Erectus had primitive technology. There would have been campsites, villages, and fire. There would have been a ton of evidence for their existence, and yet we do not see that evidence. What we do see, though, is an abrupt appearance with unique differences in humans. Erectus has very human-like qualities and unique differences not seen in prior hominins. And this is from its first appearance. Humans have always been humans in the fossil record, with no gradual transition from more ape-like creatures to humans. As a matter of fact, years ago, Mary Leakey discovered footprints that are indistinguishable from modern human footprints. As a matter of fact, if these footprints were discovered today, nobody, not even Aron Ra, would question these footprints. They would all conclude that they were made by barefooted human beings. Evolutionists have dated these footprints to roughly 3 or 4 million years ago, and therefore, because of their circular reasoning, they cannot conclude these were made by humans.
Shut up!
Aron Ra looks to Australopithecus afarensis, while Lucy herself was found in hundreds of pieces over a large area. Isn't it hilarious that the genetic data does not fit Aron Ra's model? And so he wants to look to low quality, low confidence scientific data. When they say they have hundreds of specimens of Lucy's species, what they actually mean is 400 pieces of bones. Many of these bones even turn out to be teeth. What we find in terms of paleoanthropology is deliberate exaggeration. Even Lee Berger, a famous paleoanthropologist, has pointed out that there are more people working in the field than there are actual objects to study. He points out most of the record pertaining to human origins is bone fragments, bits and pieces of post-cranial bones and teeth, lots of teeth. You'll oftentimes see these skulls propped up as, say, Lucy's skull, when in fact, most of what you have is a few skull fragments, with most of the reconstructed skull being inference-based. There are massive differences that exist in terms of genetics that refutes the idea that humans and chimpanzees are related. Some of the amazing differences include human-specific genes, multifunctional and multi-purpose genes, differential gene expression, unique transcription factors, non-coding DNA and its many amazing functions not predicted by evolutionists. The FOXP2 gene, signs and lines, long non-coding RNAs, genomic networks, and more. Aron Ra might scoff at the existence of deleterious mutation accumulation. He may attempt to say and reject the scientific data by making the claim that there is no evidence. Well, it turns out that Dr. John Sanford and colleagues have developed a massive computer program, Mendel's accountant. It is actually the most sophisticated evolutionary modeling system ever written. You can literally take any mutation rate you want, any mutation distribution, population size, all these parameters you can apply. You can apply these artificial populations. We then allow it to run its course. We look to natural selection and we find over and over and over again that any realistic set of parameters, evolution does not work. Genetic degeneration is inevitable and Aron Ra has no answer. The rescue devices he could look to: truncation selection, mutation count mechanisms, synergistic epistasis, super beneficial mutations, trade-offs, you name it. They have all been looked at, analyzed, and published, and they all fail. They all fail miserably. They've been falsified. What we observe in the fossil record is death, degeneration, and extinction. And this is all consistent with the Genesis starting point. Now, there are a couple different things going on that give the evolutionary community the impression that human evolution is true. One is that there are often artificial species that consist of a mixture of ape and human beings. The sites paleoanthropologists would go to for their next big missing link are often scattered with fragmented bones. Consequently, bones of multiple species would be confused as one single species, when in fact they were separate species, humans and apes. The bones are being found together at these excavation sites, intermingled. For example, Australopithecus sediba and Homo habilis could be artificial constructs that consist of a loose collection of human and ape bones. Ella Bin and Yoel Rak hold this view of Australopithecus sediba based on the lumbar vertebra and jaw bones that are derived from two different genera. Also, Australopithecus afarensis is claimed by experts to be a chimeric species. It is a jumble of bones from multiple species. Even Donald Johanson has reported at one time that at least two different species from two different genera were represented in his bones. Some fossils even looking exactly like human fossils. Many of the hominin fossils are clear evidence of rapid genomic degeneration. Yet proponents of human evolution point to them as evidence for ape-to-man evolution. This rapid genomic degeneration is due to inbreeding, isolation, and founder effects. Many of these hominin fossils clearly display anomalous pathologies. This would reveal that in the past, several isolated and inbred human populations have experienced what is called reductive evolution. This is essentially devolution. Well, what has this type of reductive evolution resulted in? The answer to this question is genetic pathologies. These numerous genetic pathologies would be reduced body size and reduced brain size. Genetic degeneration is very real and cannot be denied. We see it today, and we also see it in the past. We see it in the fossil record. Homo naledi, a frequently pointed to example of human evolution, is simply more evidence of reductive evolution. This is what we see. Naledi was clearly inbred and suffered from genetic degeneration, again resulting in reduced body size, reduced brain volume, and various pathologies. The same thing is observed in Erectus. Although less advanced, the reductive evolution is clearly present. And so, several of the bones of the purported Homo species, like the hobbits, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, and Homo neanderthalensis, appear to demonstrate testimony of serious inbreeding and genetic degeneration. This would be, of course, due to post-Babel dispersion of people groups. Many of the people groups would have migrated to parts of the earth that were less than ideal. If a people group, for example, became isolated and inbreeding resulted as a consequence, rapid genetic degeneration would occur. Harsh environmental conditions in the immediate post-flood world would also lead to disease, nutrition deficiencies, and environmental related genetic degeneration. There were many negative factors at play in the immediate post-flood and post-Babel world that would lead to accelerated genetic decay of small people groups. This means that many of the troubling human fossils that evolutionary proponents say are pre-human are better realized to be devolution. We oftentimes see morphological and genetic degeneration. We are told by the evolutionists that these fossils are evidence for ape-to-man evolution, when in fact, this is just more evidence of genetic entropy. Genetic entropy is a reality, and the critics deny this reality. They deny reality. The so-called primitive features that the apologists and the defenders of ape-to-man evolution had pointed to, in the case of the hobbits, also known as Homo floresiensis, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, Homo neanderthalensis, do not actually show they were less than human. They were not pre-human. They were all fully human. As a matter of fact, they were all made in the image of God. They did not evolve from pre-human creatures. More correctly, they were human communities, 100% human, that were persistently inbred and were in genetic decline. Exactly what would be expected from a post-Babel model. As we can see in the fossil record, pathology and genetic degeneration appears to be a common theme. This is the rule, it's not an exception. Experts in human evolution would have us believe that Homo erectus evolved into modern humans, when in fact the evidence appears to indicate that modern humans, ultimately of course descending from Adam and Eve, the first couple, changed into what proponents of evolution say are pre-humans and oftentimes transitional. These people groups were 100% human and made in the image of God. As the evidence appears to suggest, these post-Babel and sometimes possibly pre-Babel people groups were eventually driven to extinction by either genetic degeneration or human conquest. Since these isolated tribes went extinct first, these would be what the evolutionary community proposes are the earliest ancestors. Also, based on what we understand about the Babel event, it is apparent that the various ape types, including the Australopithecines, would have spread out before humans. Therefore, what we see in the bone beds reflects the different migration patterns of both the ape types and humans. When proponents of human evolution assert that ape-like creatures such as Lucy evolved first, what they misunderstand is that they spread out first. This is what the evidence suggests, and this is not a forward progression of ape-like creatures evolving into humans. This is simply all a reflection of post-flood and post-Babel history, perfectly consistent and expected based on the biblical model of ancestry. Another thing to consider is that we are not beholding the arrival of culture from ape-like or animal-like ancestors. We are observing a rekindling of culture by people who essentially lost everything once that confusion at Babel happened. When we think about the Tower of Babel and the groups of people living there and working together to produce it, we can think of it like our own community that we live in. We all have our own jobs. We have got people that work in the hospital, people who work in construction, people who make and distribute food. We have got farmers, police officers, we've got accountants, and numerous types of doctors. As a matter of fact, this list could go on forever. No one person does it all. These jobs are broken up amongst the people to live a functioning and operating community. Now we can imagine what stemmed from the confusion of the languages at the Tower of Babel scene. Maybe one group had no real practical skills at building or hunting or even farming. This means that these groups of people deficient in these types of skills would end up living a very primitive life. Some would even look at it as prehistoric. This is exactly what we are seeing in the fossil record. The case is closed. The evidence best fits the biblical model of ancestry, the very same evidence that the evolutionary community and the proponents of ape-to-man evolution look to as evidence is actually evidence for independent origins.
You can notice they deceptively put long hair on Lucy because only human beings grow long hair on the top of their heads, not a single primate does. More lies and trickery from evolutionists, no surprise there. Here's Lucy standing next to a human. As you can see, identical twins. Almost every fossil we've found that had enough spine to study, we found evidence for lumbar lordosis. That means it will adapt and change depending on one's lifestyle. So if you stand or sit upright for long periods of time, it will develop a series of curves that help the center of gravity, well, stay centered. Even children who sit or crawl develop this. Again, this is known as lumbar lordosis. Seeing this isn't proof of bipedal evolution. It's something that develops over an individual's life depending on how they move or sit. If a primate spends most of its day sitting upright, or if a monkey stands on two legs, as some of the street performers or circuses force them to do, they will get lumbar lordosis. Lucy is nothing but a primate that lived its life in the trees, that also was able to sit for long periods of time, just like baboons today do. So what did Lucy spend most of her time doing? Well, sitting in trees for most of the days, staying away from predator, and standing to see over tall grasses while on the ground. Australopithecus actually means southern ape, and she has proven to be nothing but an extinct form of ape, which closely resembles many modern-day chimpanzees in height, arm length, skull shape, teeth, mandible size, structure, and many other details. Of course she was a chimp. She lived mostly in the trees and sitting down. She has a powerful upper body, spent most of times from climbing in the trees. She even died falling out of a tree.
The debate about whether Lucy's species spent most of their time walking on land or in the trees has continued since her discovery in 1974. However, since further measurements and X-ray CT scans of her upper arms, scientists have somewhat confirmed Lucy's arms to be more similar to those of primates.
Living fossils is just one of 4 simultaneous experiments that I carried out to test evolution. It was based on a simple prediction that if evolution was not true, and if animals did not change over time, I should be able to find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is in fact what I found. First, I found a fossil shrimp in a dinosaur rock layer that looked very similar to a modern appearing Gulf shrimp. Then I found a crayfish in a dinosaur layer that looked like a modern crayfish. Then a crab, then a prawn, then a lobster. Soon I realized I had found all of the major crustacean groups in the dinosaur rock layers. Then I turned my attention to the insects. First I found a modern appearing dragonfly that was found in a dinosaur rock layer. Then a katydid, then a cockroach, then a cricket, and soon I had representatives of all of the major insect groups living today from the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Then I had representatives of all the shellfish groups, the echinoderm groups, etc. And soon I realized that I had representatives of all of the major invertebrate phyla living today. I had found these in the dinosaur rock layers and they looked the same. Next, I turned my attention to the vertebrates, and here I ran into problems. Museums were, for the most part, not displaying the most important vertebrate fossils. They were kept out of the view of the public. So I turned to the literature and began interviewing scientists, asking if they had seen any modern appearing vertebrates with the dinosaurs. And lo and behold, they had. Dr. Clemens reported finding a modern appearing parrot in a dinosaur rock layer. Others reported finding ducks, loons, flamingos with dinosaurs. This was utterly amazing. And others reported finding shrew-like animals, squirrel-like animals, platypus-like mammals, and other mammals in the dinosaur rock layers. Now, I did not find any of the larger mammals in the dinosaur rock layers, but this could just as easily be explained by a misinterpretation of the geological layers, which I'll explain in the 4th video. Lastly, I turned my attention to the plants, and once again, I found representatives of all of the major plant divisions living today in the dinosaur rock layers, and they looked the same. Sequoias with dinosaurs, oak trees with dinosaurs, magnolias, dogwoods, etc. It was amazing. In summary, I predicted that if evolution was not true, I would find modern appearing plants and modern appearing animals in the dinosaur rock layers. And this is in fact what I found.
It's proven. You have the fossil record. It shows all the steps. Fossils don't prove evolution.
Fossils don't mean anything as far as evolution is concerned. We don't need them. Forget fossils. They just aren't important. We have a very good set of bones saved from fossil records showing that the whales evolved through a long period of time from animals that were on land to animals that are in the water. Fossils don't mean anything as far as evolution is concerned. We don't need them.
Evolution is very much a part of that tradition. We are constantly revising.
Tradition? You don't have to trust tradition. I mean, come on, there's different traditions all over the world.
And you start from very simple life, and eventually you get everything that we have around us, from elephants to alligators to chimpanzees and everything in between.
According to Chen, the fossils he's discovered turned Darwin's tree of life upside down.
Darwin's tree, reverse concept, very unexpectedly, our research convincing major phyla starting down below at beginning of Cambrian. Base is wide, gradually narrow, so this is almost turned on different way.
Genomic research also shows periods of population reduction, with measured mutation rates to indicate when. These are consistent enough that comparative genomics of different populations shows that about 12,000 years ago, some unidentified cataclysm wiped out about 3/4 of most large mammals. This is not concordant with the flood, either in timing or effect. Some species went extinct, some came through all right, but cheetahs barely survived, meaning that so few of them made it through that there was a population bottleneck, causing a loss of genetic diversity. This left cheetah DNA with the deficiency of being effectively inbred. That was 12,000 years ago, thousands of years before the world existed, according to young earth science deniers, and cheetahs are still suffering this effect. Now, if there was a global flood, it wouldn't just be cheetahs. Every terrestrial vertebrate would be similarly deficient. Studies of the human genome show that we've experienced a number of bottlenecks too, mostly associated with migration combined with a number of environmental factors. The most significant of these was more than 70,000 years ago, when the entire human population was reduced to only a few thousand individuals. Imagine how much worse it would be if it were ever down to just 2 individuals, 1 male and 1 female, such that all their descendants had to be incestuous. If there had ever been a global flood, then every species would be severely compromised by a lack of genetic diversity.
I'm really, really excited for this one. This one's one of my favorite topics here. So let's get right into it. Now, I think this is obvious because a direct expectation from the biblical model, okay, is in fact low genetic diversity in human beings. This is simply because God tells us in Genesis, okay, that he created 2 people, Adam and Eve. What would this do? Well, this would restrict levels of genetic diversity. Okay, this would restrict levels of genetic diversity also in the mitochondrial DNA, the Y chromosome, and this is exactly what we see, extremely low genetic variation, pointing us back to the first couple, Adam and Eve. Modern genetic data has confirmed these expectations. And these claims made in Genesis are very, very specific. They did not have to be true. And yet, low genetic diversity is exactly what we see. We are 99.999% similar. Anybody on this planet. Now, the evolutionary community, I want to point out, they were completely shocked by this. Okay, because if the evolutionary fairy tale were true, for example, and man has actually evolved from ape-like ancestors, okay, the Australopithecines are evolving for millions of years, and you've got, the so-called transitional forms like habilis or sediba, for example. And then you've got Erectus, who's living on the planet for millions of years, accumulating more and more genetic diversity. Mutations by definition add genetic diversity because a mutation is adding something that was not previously there. Okay, so millions of years of human evolution, we would then expect higher levels of genetic diversity, and that's not what we've discovered. We've found low levels of genetic diversity. So what the evolutionary community had to do was invent a post hoc, ad hoc, out of Africa evolutionary bottleneck. It's rescue device upon rescue device upon rescue device with these evolutionists. And the reason why they invoked this was to reduce levels of heterozygosity and increase levels of homozygosity, okay? And what's funny is, according to the human evolution story, this would have been a prolonged population bottleneck. And this is necessary according to their model because they need to reduce those levels of genetic diversity to roughly where they are today to explain the data. We did not have to explain away the data. We didn't have to do that. And this is why it's post hoc ad hoc. They've essentially, what they've done is they've retrofitted the data, the genetic data, into their story. But what's funny is the rescue device that they invoke, this hypothetical out of Africa population bottleneck, it would have been extremely genetically compromising to that population of, say, 2 to 10,000, because we know inbreeding by definition reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. These mutations that have been accumulating for millions of years, they are in a recessive state. These are then manifested, and what they do is they lead to accelerated genetic degeneration. Okay, these deleterious mutations, they're coming to the forefront. This population of 2 to 10,000 would have been so genetically compromised that there is no feasible way to then have this population suddenly explode into all parts of the world, seizing dominion over the planet. This population would have been at near extinction. And we have an example of this today with cheetahs, for example. They're down to about 7,000. They're highly degenerated. They're genetically compromised. Conservationists are worried about their possible extinction. Their sperm is degenerate. We're not going to suddenly expect this population of 7,000 cheetahs to explode into all parts of the world and just suddenly seize dominion over the planet. And I know that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, okay, but that is what these evolutionists are proposing with their highly genetically compromised population of 2 to 10,000, okay? So here's the point to take away from this. Biblical creationists, we expected, based on the starting point of 2, Adam and Eve. Okay, this would restrict levels of genetic diversity. This turns out to be the case. Human beings are all 99.9% similar. The low genetic diversity, that confirms what? Well, it confirms that we have all originated from just 2 people, Adam and Eve, just thousands of years ago. And as we know, as we covered in that moment, the low genetic diversity was exactly what biblical creationists expected to find. The evolutionary community, because of the evidence, had no choice but to resort to a hypothetical out of Africa population bottleneck in order to explain away the low genetic diversity found in human beings. This is essentially storytelling. This is a rescue device. And it's an invention that was invoked simply to explain away the genetic related data. The genetic related data that doesn't support ape to man evolution, nor does it support universal common ancestry in general. So, as we know, according to their post hoc ad hoc story, it would have been highly damaging, since it consisted of not just a 1 generation bottleneck followed by rapid and exponential population growth like us, like our model, okay? It consisted of an extended bottleneck, a prolonged bottleneck, in order to reduce levels of genetic diversity that they did not predict, by the way. This is why it is exactly a post hoc ad hoc rescue device. It was essentially a near extinction event, an event that was connected with severe inbreeding. And we know genetically, we know what inbreeding does. We know what the effects are, because these mutations, they come to the forefront and they lead to rapid and accelerated genetic degeneration. They're manifested essentially because of inbreeding. This is not a good thing, and this is why this fairy tale that the evolutionary community invokes is not even somewhat reasonable. And this is why those who hold to evolutionary theory and ape to man evolution, this is why they have an unsolvable problem. And this is the issue. This is the issue with explaining all DNA differences, all DNA diversity, as a result of what? As a result of mutations, as a result of genetic mistakes over time, essentially. We start with the assumption that God would have front-loaded Adam and Eve, which applies universally across the biblical kinds. God would have front-loaded them with created nuclear heterozygosity, because when God said to be fruitful and multiply, did God mean for this to be carried out through cloning? Of course not. Of course not. God did not say to be fruitful and clone yourselves. He said be fruitful and multiply. So this is why the starting point of design diversity makes sense both theologically and scientifically. Now, here's what I find funny, guys. The fact that the critic will very frequently, and I've had almost 100 debates, and I have discussed and debated the critic on this argument more times than I could count. The argument has to do with inbreeding. They'll say we have an inbreeding problem according to the biblical base model of ancestry and independent origins, okay? Here's the thing though. As I said, it's based on a straw man, it's based on a misrepresentation. There's no problem at all. Let me briefly explain why we don't have a problem with inbreeding like the evolutionists do. Think about it. According to the model of independent origins, according to our model of biblical ancestry, we start with just two people, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were specially created by God, just roughly 6,000 years ago. And then 10 generations later, we have a second bottleneck of what? Of just 8 people. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives. So 8 people. At creation, since we hold to the design diversity hypothesis, Adam and Eve would have started with no mutations. No mutations. This goes back to genetic entropy, okay? We take this point of most accumulating mutational load, okay? This point of most genetic entropy, okay? Take that back to a point in time of least accumulating mutations, okay? A point of least genetic entropy, that would be point of creation. That would be this point of Adam and Eve with no mutations. So 10 generations later, we now have this second, another benign bottleneck. It is a single generation bottleneck, also followed by rapid and exponential growth. Now remember, inbreeding reveals the hidden reservoir of genetic mistakes. If there are no genetic mistakes to be manifested to lead to the negative and damaging problems that inbreeding results in, according to our model, Adam and Eve would have had no mutations, and at the flood there would have been some mutations, but not nearly enough to lead to the type of genetic degeneration that the evolutionary model would consist of. Because remember, the evolutionists explain all DNA differences as the result of mutations over time. So by the time they get to their bottleneck, they've had millions of years of mutation accumulation, because adding mutations adds genetic diversity. So they explain the origin of genetic diversity, that natural selection can act upon this variation. They explain this as the result of mutations. So now they've got a ton of mutations that are just waiting to be manifested, just waiting to be revealed in order to lead to rapid, essentially, genetic degeneration. Well, we explain the majority of DNA differences as a result of created nuclear heterozygosity, okay? So according to the biblical model, both bottlenecks, creation and the flood, were extremely, extremely brief. Just one generation. It's a one generation bottleneck, not an extended bottleneck like the evolutionary community believes in. And most importantly, it was followed up by explosive growth, rapid and exponential population growth. This means that most of the original created heterozygosity would not have been lost. They would have retained most of it, okay? Based on the fact that these bottlenecks were brief and followed up by rapid and exponential population growth. So the whole point is, guys, in both bottlenecks, you'd have almost no accumulated mutations, okay? So no negative, essentially, inbreeding effects genetically. That means that the extremely limited genetic diversity is most consistent with the biblical base model. When God created 2 people, automatically this restricted genetic diversity. And all of this genetic data that we now have did not have to be true. This is why we don't have to resort to fairy tale and far-fetched mental inventions in storytelling. It's the evolutionists that have to resort to this type of storytelling. So point is, the evolutionary model has the inbreeding problem, and the biblical model does not have an inbreeding problem for all the reasons that I've explained above.
During the creation of Eve, we can also see something else. Eve was directly created from Adam, making her and his genomes identical. And this was not a problem either, since Adam had built-in created genetic differences. This is why God told Adam to be fruitful and multiply, not be fruitful and clone yourself. Why would God even bother creating diversity in the first place if he wanted clones everywhere? It makes no logical sense, because it's not true. Without built-in genetic diversity, all life would be the same. God loves diversity, and we can see this when we look around at the animal kingdom and even other stars and planets. But genetically, with this built-in created heterozygosity, it shows us that within all life, different creatures have different built-in created design differences. And we can find this in their nuclear DNA. And this is what we look to determine hierarchy and, to some extent, what is related. However, what discriminates between the creation and the evolutionary model is the functional design differences between life. For example, if we look at two people and they are both wearing red shoes, does this mean that the shoes are of the same brand? No, of course not. Though they look similar and can be taken and lined up into a nested hierarchical pattern, it doesn't prove anything. One pair of shoes was directly made for running. They have a spring in the heel, an extra cushion for impact, with arch support and laces that were created to not wear out, with waterproof exterior created for dealing with the harsh elements. As were the other pair of shoes, though they look identical, were created for bowling. With zero traction, they were designed to slide across a waxed hard flat surface and enhance the performance while bowling, and that's it. So though the two may look similar from a distance and would be classified as shoes, they are functionally different and were created as such. Therefore, if we see something that looks similar, that is not enough to determine relation. Are boots related to shoes? They both go on your feet, right? But no one would ever call them shoes. But if you draw a circle wide enough, you can now classify them as being related because of that feature of them going on your feet. This is what evolutionists have done with their classification scheme. They have made a circle big enough to capture everything, and then pretend that it's proof that everything is related. So do not fall for their semantics. That is all cladistics has become. Now, in regard to mitochondria, this was created brand new, without any genetic mutational differences at all. All differences in the mitochondria have arisen recently, over time, from mutations. Therefore, we can look to the mitochondria as a clock that can determine age, but we look to the nuclear differences to determine relation. This also explains why inbreeding was not a problem either, because the genome is so large that it took a very long time before it became an issue. The global flood bottleneck essentially reset genetic diversity, and it was only after many generations that intermarrying was no longer viable and a law of incest was given to mankind. The critics of biblical creation believe that you cannot just take a single pair of animals and place them on a boat and have them get off and repopulate the world. They believe that the inbreeding would lead to their demise, and they also will certainly not recover after this bottleneck. But what do we find? Exactly what the Bible describes and exactly what our model predicted. We have multiple examples of many different types of animals being reduced in number that recover easily from just a small inbreeding population. This can happen as long as it's just a short single-generation bottleneck as described in the Bible. Ironically, it's the evolutionary model that actually has the inbreeding problem, because it's their bottlenecks that are not only constant over eons of time, but they last for many thousands of years in small populations. The reality is clear. Evolution is a complete lie, and the only way they can make any sense of their pathetic story is by making up imaginary population sizes that were just large enough to survive over long periods of time without having an inbreeding issue. But the observable evidence cannot be ignored, and it all points to the validity of Scripture, and the critics of young Earth creation hate it. What do we see when we look at the mitochondria in all life? We see that mutations are rapidly occurring. But if this is true, then how can deep time evolution be true? Well, it can't. It's just that simple. It's why we see low genetic diversity in all life forms. Yet, mutation saturation hasn't occurred in the mitochondria. And this is why evolution can't account for the low genetic diversity in all life, except if they invoke a worldwide bottleneck, the very thing that they are so against, catastrophism. Yet, they must invoke it, or else they are ignoring the clear genetic data. They are stuck between a rock and a hard place. In one hand, they hold all the evidence that shows that life arose recently, and in the other hand, they have to admit that Noah's global bottleneck and the biblical narrative are true. Either way, they are finished, and this is why they try to spin the data without any physical evidence, even in their own made-up geologic column. And they admit this. This isn't me making it up. What evolution does is it takes the evidence and then builds the story around it. That way, they can always claim to have the evidence on their side. But what they have done is not actually science. It is force-fitted data to validate their narrative. Remember, the Bible is true and the data already fits it. We can't go back and change scripture. That wouldn't even be possible. We're stuck with what it says, and the evidence lines up perfectly. They have to come along with their pagan theory and say that the data fits it better. And this is why they fight young Earth creation with a religious fervor, as though they are deeply religious people themselves. And they are, following a pagan belief. This is why it's called naturalism, and it's a philosophy. Don't be fooled, because they can and will lie to you and try to make you believe otherwise. You see, they need pawn scum to people evolution to be true, or else creation is true. They cannot have this, and they fight it hard by any means necessary. This is why they fight to keep it out of the classroom.
There were a handful of different species or subspecies, and they too spread out of Africa, again, in multiple ways. Homo erectus, for example, spread all over Asia and Europe as well as Africa, where they evidently first appeared. And although they're considered to be a single species, Homo erectus is much more diverse than modern humans. I mean, we found hundreds of Neanderthals and other distinguishable human groups who were all noticeably similar to each other, but Homo erectus varied remarkably, both in their assorted sizes and the range of sizes of their brains. And if they were that different on the inside, then how would Java man compare to Dimanasi, for example, on the outside? How did their behaviors or habits differ from each other? There's no way to know without a time machine. Isn't that a shame? You may have seen another sensational news story talking about 315,000-year-old anatomically modern Homo sapien fossils recently discovered in Morocco. Why is this significant? Well, it's 100,000 years older than we thought that they would be, but also understand that modern man, Neanderthals, and Denisovans are all descended from an earlier species, Homo heidelbergensis, which also originated in Africa, itself a descendant of Homo erectus. Then they spread across Africa, and some of them made it out into the Middle East, where Neanderthals and Denisovans were born, so to speak. They're the only two human groups that apparently originated outside of Africa. Then they diverged and went their separate ways. And sometime after that, we emerged from heidelbergensis tribes that were still in Africa. We share a common ancestor. Sapiens, Neanderthals, and Denisovans are like brothers of the same father. Neanderthals are like our older brothers, a couple 100,000 years older. They were tougher and stronger than us, and even had bigger brains than most of us, yet they didn't make it.
Everything that he's mentioning thinks it's helping his argument. It's not. It's showing how superior ancient man is, proving our side. Because Neanderthal were better, smarter, and faster than us in every way, even running. Anthropologist Peter McAllister recently published a book titled Manthropology, The Science of Inadequate Modern Man. An analysis of the footsteps of one of the men's footprints was preserved in a fossil clay pan lake bed in Australia, dubbed T8. It shows signs that the runner reached speeds of 37 kilometers per hour in a soft, muddy lake edge. Yes, he was moving at 23 miles per hour. Neanderthal were extremely fast and extremely strong, far superior than people today. Evolutionist George Johnson perhaps unwittingly illustrated this in his biology book, The Living World, when he wrote, "Thoroughbred racehorses are all descendants of a small initial group of individuals, and selected for speed. It has accomplished all it can with a limited amount of genetic variability. The winning times in major racehorses ceased to improve decades ago." We think that pre-flood man lived about 900 years, some of them. In order for this to be true, pre-flood man's physiology had to be superior than ours. Neanderthal had better bone structure, and their bones were thicker and stronger than ours. They had better muscle tone. Neanderthal have up to 50% more asymmetry, better occlusion, stronger teeth, and larger brain cavity. This makes a valid argument saying that Neanderthals were smarter than us because it's been linked that brain size and intelligence are correlated. We have now found evidence that Neanderthal DNA is 99.5% identical with present-day humans, and that Neanderthal DNA appears to fall inside the variation of present-day humans. Neanderthal had less hair on their backs than present-day humans do in theirs. This is due to a genetic marker, RS4849721. This marker is shared by Neanderthal and present-day humans. For example, if you have a T at this marker position, you probably have less hair than average. Neanderthals have the T, which means they too probably had far less back hair than the average present-day human. So that's much less hairy of an ape man, don't you think?
Were Neanderthals human beings made in the image of God? Or are they evidence for human evolution? What does the evidence tell us? It turns out that Neanderthals are fully human, and this has been confirmed by modern scientific data. We will get into some of that evidence shortly. Firstly, though, if you went back 100 years, you would see a drastic difference in how Neanderthals were interpreted. Evolutionists at the time asserted Neanderthals were some half ape, half man, brutish type creature. And yet now we know they were highly intelligent and highly sophisticated. We know they were highly inventive with a diverse diet. Neanderthals had boats and exhibited purposeful navigation. What animal other than humans make boats and navigate the open seas? This, of course, requires high levels of intelligence. They even got to some of the islands in the Mediterranean that were never connected to the mainland. We know they buried their dead, had music. They were into cosmetics. They painted in caves. They had the capabilities to control fire. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They were clearly human beings made in the image of God. And worst of all, for the evolutionist, we have their genes. We interbred with them. We also know that Neanderthals have the same FOXP2 gene that gives modern humans the ability to speak. Genetics is the best way to determine ancestry, and the genetic evidence tells us that Neanderthals interbred with the direct ancestors of modern people. Looking to the biological species concept, then we are by definition the same species. Now it appears that people outside of Africa carry 3 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. We literally have their genes. In light of all this data, how could anybody claim Neanderthals were not fully human and related to our first couple, Adam and Eve? There are some militant critics of biblical creation and the biblical model of ancestry that do reject the clear facts by using an argument that goes like this. They will say, Neanderthals exhibit a different set of biodiversity compared to Homo sapiens. And when we characterize and quantify those differences, this ends up putting Neanderthals as a sister group, as compared to the same species as Homo sapiens. To represent the argument as accurately as possible, the argument insists that it is not about the quantity of differences. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens are 99.7% similar, but it is about the specific differences. When we look at specific genetic markers found in Neanderthals that are not found in any Homo sapiens, we can also look at genetic markers that are in Homo sapiens that are not found in Neanderthals. This indicates that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens belong to separate clades that share a common ancestor according to the evolutionary model. So the question is, why were Neanderthals different? Well, first of all, they experienced different environmental conditions. They had a different history. And they were also literally the most inbred population we have ever seen. When you look at their runs of homozygosity, you quickly realize that they have extremely high levels of homozygosity. They have these massive stretches of identical letters in their genomes, which means there was a ton of inbreeding. And this is population-wide. Neanderthals changed over time. The classic Neanderthals we think of today were highly inbred with a very high genetic load, and they were 40% less fit than modern humans today. They were on the verge of extinction. They were extremely well adapted as well to their cold environmental conditions. Why are they different? This is obvious. Neanderthals would have started off different, being an early branch of man. Early man would have been more diverse. The evidence suggests that they picked up a ton of mutations over time for a number of plausible and empirical reasons. They were also probably founded by an early patriarch in his old age. Man would have lived longer in the pre-flood world and the immediate post-flood world, and so Neanderthals would have started off with a gigantic number of new mutations and already possessed a different set of biodiversity.
They need to indoctrinate the kids while their mind is weak. If somebody is listening to me right now that believes in evolution, they are probably too unhappy and too mad to even hear what I'm saying. But I'm asking you to be a critical thinker and ask yourself, why do you believe that evolution is true? And why do you think people arose in Africa and left in the out of Africa theory to begin with? I sure hope your answer isn't because the masses believe something, because that's a horrible answer. And I hope, rather, it's instead the real answer. Genetic differences, right? You see, they looked and saw that Africans had more mutations than Europeans, and said, well, if this is true, then Africans must have been around longer, and therefore there must have been a later out of Africa event. Simple logic, really. That was until we discovered there are lots of other reasons that Africans could have more mutations than Europeans, even if they arose at the same time. We found PRDM9 variants were common in Africans but rare in Europeans. Since PRDM9 determines how fast recombination occurs, and since Africans have faster recombination rates, it is obvious they would have more mutation differences because of this alone. But then we find different conditions in different geographical locations also make a huge difference, such as altitude. Thus, higher mutation rates at lower altitudes could have higher mutation rates. Then we find warmer temperature locations also speed up mutation rates. Well, Africa is an extremely warm region. And then we find Africans also have shorter generation times. The matter of fact, where diversity is the highest in Africa is where generation time is the lowest. And since this speeds up mutation rates, this also accounts for why Africans would have more diversity. Not because evolution is true, or that Africans have been around longer. Then along comes young Earth creationist Dr. Jensen, who predicted that the most diverse African groups will be found to mutate twice as fast in their mtDNA. So we are the ones making mutation rate predictions. We are the ones that are predicting things. Evolution does not, because it can't, and they admit that they cannot, therefore making it not science. So what I have shown you is that we have multiple ways of explaining why evolution has interpreted the evidence wrong, and they are too afraid to make any predictions based on evolution regarding the rate of molecular change because of it. So, as you can see, we have a better answer to why Africans appear to be older, but they are not. and we are the ones making predictions. Evolution is not. So when we put down the Bible and we line it up with the science, the evidence fits.
This is one of those rare occasions where the news story really was sensational even before the headline spiced it up. These so-called hobbits of Flores Island, Homo floresiensis, were a race of tiny people only about a meter tall. Whether you count them as human depends on what you think a human is. If it's just Homo sapiens and no other species, then hobbits are not human. I think any species in the genus Homo qualifies. Either way, here is another species whose ancestors came from the Dark Continent, and yet these hobbits are unknown outside Indonesia.
Come on, man, really? Just investigate them for a minute.
Matt, like we asked Guts and Gibbon, and we're going to ask Aron, if they want to maintain that, Floresiensis, the hobbits got to Flores, because if it's Erectus, right, like some paleo experts agree, it makes sense because Erectus is human. They had the brain power and the intelligence to sail, purposeful navigation to the island of Flores, which makes sense. We see the stone tool use. We see many indications that they were human. Even Aron Ra said that they probably would have been able to interbred. But this is too close for comfort because this fits our model, okay? So now a lot of them are saying that, no, and it was an Australopith-like ancestor that would have evolved into the hobbits, which means they're saying that an Australopithecine, which does not have the brain power to navigate the open seas, they're now saying that these brain-dead apes accidentally rafted to Flores. A viable breeding population accidentally got there. Matt, what are your thoughts on those 2 points? I know you also heard this.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't make any sense logically, because let's say that the current did take them there arbitrarily and they just landed on this thing. Well, now they've just landed on an island where it's even worse for them, right? So they've landed in a place where they've literally admitted, oh, they are going through reductive evolution, right? They have a lot of abnormalities and they have a lot of problems from interbreeding. So now you're going to tell me that they're going through this interbreeding, but they're evolving better than their ancestors were, and they're learning these new skills and trades, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a great point.
That's exactly the opposite of what would actually occur if they were stuck on an inbreeding island and things were shifting from heterozygosity to homozygosity and they were getting more similarly related. You would get more genetic diseases and more mutations. So there's that. And then another one is, think about what the mainland was actually like. We believe that it was right after the flood. Things were ice. And this was when Neanderthal and Denisovan were up in these areas, and it was bad. So therefore, they knew to try to sail to an island to get away from the bad conditions and get to more of a tropical area. That's why Africa did so good. That's why people that did migrate there stayed there, because they flourished there more, because it's more near the equator. So that's what we see with these people. They tried to leave, and they're stuck on the mainland, and they're eating mammoth, and they're like, we got to get out of here. It's absolutely freezing. We have small tribes, and then we are warring with one another over the scarce food that there already is. I say we pack up, grab a couple animals, we throw them on a boat, we travel out to some islands. We got to get out of here. Anything is better than where we're at. What happened? They got stuck on an island. Boom, that's the history. That's what we see.
And it led to rapid and accelerated genetic degeneration. That's such a good point you brought up. I'd love to see somebody who's just desperate to the point where they got to say some apes accidentally made their way to Flores. So that means the Australopithecine would have evolved on the island into Homo floresiensis and gained those abilities for tool use and human-like qualities. And according to Aron Ra, they were able to probably breed if they wanted to remain interfertile, when in fact what there would be is devolution, degeneration, island dwarfism. That's such a great point. And then What's funny is her other argument, which was kind of reiterated here from Dessel. We talked about this. We had a good laugh because she tried to say, well, there's and I'm sure Aron Ra would use the same argument, so we should put it to bed. Like iguanas and local marine species that make their way to islands, for example, and the elephants, because we know that there's dwarfed elephants on Flores as well. So, they're claiming that, well, if they're able to make their way to these islands and become isolated and live there, then why not some Australopith, right? What's your answer to that, Matt?
Well, the first part I wanted to answer real quick is, how can they say that these people died out while at the same time saying that they're progressively going up in evolution? And
right? Two contradictory things.
Right. Okay, so let's see. What happens today when people are actually going to be going off to islands? What do they usually bring with them? Like the Polynesians when they go to Hawaii. They bring with them fruits, they bring with them seeds, they bring with them anything that they can travel to eat, right? So what happens when you're going to be traveling? Well, they also took goats. Well, goats actually ended up ruining one of the islands of Hawaii. To the south of the island of Kauai, there's an island that's there. It's owned by the government now, and nobody else can live there except for local Hawaiians. But there's not a single tree on the island because goats eat them before they can actually grow into a tree. They've completely decimated the entire island. But that was a staple animal that a lot of people used to travel with because it was easy. They can breed the goats, they can get milk from them, and when they were getting older, after they reproduced, they would eat them for the meat. Same thing would have happened with these elephants. What do they do in India? Well, they took the elephants and they migrate with them. They travel with them. That's what they do. So we have no problem in our model saying that these Neanderthals or whoever it was that took these animals with them, these small babies, and took them to an island with them because it was their food source. It did the exact same thing that goats would have been. They would have waited for them to mature, bred, and then ate the elders like they do with pigs, anything they can. Well, back then in the Ice Age, they're not running around eating pork. They're not eating goats. They had mammoth. So they took one of these creatures, they brought them on the island, and that's what was there. Why are there lizards there? For the same reason lizards are on every island. They're the first to swim to an island. The first thing that shows up are spiders, because spiders can actually weave a web and catch their web and carry air current and almost fly to an island, basically. Then after that, it gets the insects, and then you get some rodents and lizards. So it's not speculation. That's what happens after volcanoes go up and they destroy and decimate an entire island where there's no life left. Boom, after a couple decades, everything is back. Everything is back just the way it was because that's what happens. They can swim out to islands. It's not a mystery.
Well, I got to say, slam dunk points because our critics, they're just going to dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge 99.9% of our points. And what's funny is supposedly, our points on Homo floresiensis, the hobbits being a degenerate form of human, would be demolished. And yet we pointed out that the problem of how did the pre-humans or arrive on the island of Flores, it was never accessible through a land bridge, according to their model, even during the Ice Age when the sea levels were lower. So we predicted, okay, well, Gutsy Gibbon, Aron Ra, same thing if he does a rebuttal video, so we might as well leave no stone unturned, would have to say that it either happened by accident, right, through natural rafts of vegetation, or a tsunami, something far-fetched and ridiculous, right? Maybe this could happen to one individual, but it's extremely unlikely and implausible to have occurred to a viable breeding population. Here's the thing. Here's the most parsimonious explanation. Hobbits obviously sailed to the island, which makes sense because they are a variant form of Erectus, like many paleo experts would agree. This suggests they were human because why? Purposeful navigation would be the observation here. Building boats and then navigating the open seas is clear indication that Erectus and ultimately hobbits are human, but it's too close for comfort. So they have to come up with this ridiculous excuse. And do you see how easily it was demolished and refuted? But they will still hold on to it because it's the storyboard. It's the rescue device.
Understand that if creationists were correct, then none of these fossils should exist.
Habilis is a joke. I can't believe you're using this for evidence. It has a primate hand, a primate skull, primate teeth. It's short. It even has fewer ribs. Habilis is used as the smorgasbord for body parts by evolutionists. Every time they find something strange and don't know how to classify it, it gets tossed in with the Habilis bin. The funny part about this ape is that it eats over 80 to 90% of its calories from tiger nuts. Therefore, I challenge you as a human being right now, go on Amazon and buy just a small bag of tiger nuts. Open up that bag and eat it. Eat the entire bag. I dare you. You will quickly realize that that is nothing close to a human being.
Without refrigeration or any means of preservation, it would not have been possible to store enough food just for the livestock, not for a whole year. And there wasn't much thought given to the wild animals either. How do you feed them?
What did Noah feed the animals on the ark? Where did they all go to the bathroom? Obviously, this would be a huge problem, would it not? Well, not really. The answer to this is quite simple, especially when we look at cold regions of the world like Sweden, where 7 months out of the year, it's so cold that the animals move under people's homes just to stay warm. To combat this, people are trying to keep them out, but it's nearly impossible, so people eventually just start spreading out a thin layer of wood shavings and peat moss with straw. It's called deep litter. It works by absorbing waste for up to 2 years, requiring no cleanup whatsoever, and it also absorbs smell. One of the reasons why it works so good is by not removing the waste, good microbes come and make their homes in the litter, and these microbes actually eat and break down the feces and consume unhealthy bacteria, leaving good bacteria behind. As for the animals and eating, well, remember, these are small animals. They're very young, and they have to be, because how else could they repopulate the earth if they're old? They might not even want to reproduce. So having very young, small animals on a ship would require not very much food. Also consider, nearly all animals can fall into a hibernation state to survive extreme colds or famines.
Everything about this fable is an impossible absurdity, yet somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of our adult population still believes that a 600-year-old man and 3 untrained laborers with no possible prior experience, using only Stone Age tools with none of the equipment or transportation infrastructure necessary for a building that big, somehow constructed a structurally impossibly large barge, exceeding the skill level of modern shipwrights and even exceeding the limits of physics that could be applied to such a vessel, which we can prove would have torn apart and sunk almost as soon as it got wet.
Aron starts off by mocking the biblical patriarch ages, but again, that's because he doesn't keep up with research at all. Geneticist Dr. John Sanford and Dr. Robert Carter thought they should test these genealogical ages and see what happens. They predicted that if the patriarchs were real people living to these extreme ages mentioned in the Bible, then the evidence would present itself. Lo and behold, after the ages were plotted, the results revealed what statisticians call an exponential power curve. Plotting their ages did not reveal a slow linear decline in ages as would be expected, but rather a curved one that reveals a typical biological decay curve. Exactly what we would expect to see if Noah's flood bottleneck was true and the former world had passed away, leaving humanity in a much worse state biologically. This curve literally passes every test for statistical probability. And since science deals primarily with p-value, this evidence reveals to us what is really going on is not by some chance occurrence. This pattern breaks every possibility of it being a fluke. Dr. John Sanford states that these lifespans fit so tightly along this power curve that 95% of the lifespan variance is directly explained by the number of generations from Noah. This statistical model matches the biblical data so closely that its likelihood of occurring by chance lies below 1 in 1,000. Highly improbable, to the point of absurd if you try to think that Bronze Age Hebrew sheep herders just made up these ages for symbolic reasons, just to have it fit so perfectly in line with what we know using modern science today. This exceptionally strong correlation allows us to predict how long people could live based on how many generations they are from Noah. The decay curve predicts that someone living 10 generations after Noah would have a 90% likelihood of living between the ages of 137 to 234 years of age. Similarly, it predicts with also 90% certainty that descendants alive 15 generations after Noah would live approximately between 100 and 172 years of age. This model is so powerful that the average lifespans predicted by the model are all within 10% of the actual lifespans recorded in the Bible. This close match reaches well beyond statistical coincidence. This validates that the lifespans recorded in the biblical text are true and that the people were real, not some allegorical myth or symbolic message for us to try and decipher. Noah died at 950 years of age. Noah's son Shem, however, lived after the flood only 600 years. Abraham, who was 11 generations after Noah, lived to be 175. Then we have Jacob, when he was 130 years old, telling Pharaoh that he had not lived as long as his ancestors. This is when he was 130 years of age. So clearly, if these extreme ages were fake, Jacob himself, being at this what we call today an extreme age, would have not been able to say this. Jacob eventually died at 147 years of age. Then, 7 generations after him, people were already down to living 110 years. Lifespans before the flood were stable. There was no sloping trend line whatsoever. It is only after the flood that we see this rapid decline in lifespan. Dr. Sanford himself states, "The mathematical nature of the declining lifespans arose because the biblical accounts are true and are accurately, faithfully recording the historical unfolding of some fundamental natural degenerative process. The shape of the downward slopes should be immediately recognized by any biologist. It is a biological decay curve. Noah's descendants were undergoing some type of rapid degenerative process. There is now very strong evidence that humans are degrading genetically and have been for thousands of years due to continuously accumulating mutations. This makes it very reasonable to conclude that the systematic degradation of man that is documented in the Bible was due to mutation accumulation and resultant genetic entropy." You see, we witness bottlenecks produce the exact same results we find in this study, and the evidence is clear. The Bible is not some made-up story by primitive people to help them try and sleep at night. It is the history book of the world and given to us by God for our own benefit.
And 3 untrained laborers with no possible prior experience.
Yes, you are correct. These were untrained laborers, but you don't need to be an expert to construct something when you're following directions. I don't need to be a construction worker when I get something from IKEA to put it together. And you got to remember, the instructions were given to Noah by God on how to build this thing. And you must think we are stupid and don't really actually realize that experiments have already been done to test whether the boat could withstand this. And that's right, they pass.
There are no dinosaurs in the Bible. The only dinosaurs that ever lived alongside men are birds.
The survey said,
could dinosaurs have lived with man? Now, when I look at this picture, when I think of Jurassic Park, I sometimes assume that the evolutionists think of Jurassic Park and the massive T-Rex and all the commotion and tyranny that it caused when they think of dinosaurs and living with man. Therefore, they think it to be impossible. And it's pretty common for evolutionists to make the claim that since many dinosaurs were gigantic and dangerous, they couldn't have possibly lived with humans, as people would be easy prey for them. What the evolutionists don't acknowledge, however, is that according to their own timeline, humans have lived with plenty of large, dangerous animals. over thousands of years, many of which are now extinct. Look at my slides here. We see the woolly mammoth and the American mastodon, with the same size as modern elephants, as well as this extinct relative of the Komodo dragon, which was likely encountered by the early settlers of Australia. Now, these types of animals would have proved to be a significant threat to people if anybody got close to them, and yet humans were still able to work around them, and in some cases hunt them. If you acknowledge that humans coexisted with these animals, it isn't that big of a step to suggest humans lived with dinosaurs, many of which were the same size or smaller than the animals listed in these slides. Here we can see the auroch, the short-faced bear, glyptodonts. These, even according to the evolutionists, all lived with man. Evolutionists have hijacked dinosaurs and used them to teach millions of years of evolution. When you start with the Bible, dinosaurs start to make a lot of sense. We see the geologic column here. Can man and dinosaur coexist? Well, when we look to the Bible, dinosaurs and man, according to our model, did not live in the same habitat. Just like today, we see that different creatures and different animals live in different habitats. In the pre-flood world, we see certain fossils that are usually buried together, and dinosaur fossils are usually buried with gymnosperms, pines, and naked sea plants, whereas mammal fossils are usually buried with things such as flowering plants. What does this actually indicate? This indicates two different ecosystems. For example, since we're talking about dinosaurs here, although lived at the same time of man, did not necessarily live in the same areas or habitats. They were overcome by the flood at different times during the advancing of the waters, which does explain why we don't find them buried together. It is evident that as the floodwaters rose, they buried organisms in the order that they were encountered. The accepted major groups known in the fossil record are explained by their appearance according to where they lived and not when they lived. So we looked at burial by ecosystems and habitats. Now, we can actually look to geology, which does point to a watery cataclysm. Much geologic evidence suggests rapid plate tectonics. This isn't the topic of the debate, but when we look to the layering and we look to the dinosaurs and where they're found, we can also look to the flood to confirm that. So man and dinosaur could obviously coexist, but the question is, did they? We looked at dinosaurs in the Bible. Why don't we see the word dinosaur in the Bible? I hear this question from evolutionists all the time. Well, the word dinosaur is a modern word invented in 1841. The King James Version of the Bible, on the other hand, was translated in 1611. The word dinosaur did not exist at the time the King James Bible was translated, obviously. And so it's not surprising that we would not find the word dinosaur in the Bible. We also don't find the word computer in the Bible either. Dragons. We do find the word dragon in the Bible. These giant creatures known as dinosaurs were simply called dragons. Sightings of dragons/dinosaurs have been documented and recorded throughout history. Eyewitnesses from all cultures around the earth, from England to China, have legends and stories about dragons. There are even more than 20 references to dinosaurs in the Bible. This whole controversy could easily have been avoided if they had just called dinosaur bones dragon bones. We see that the evidence that humans knew about dinosaurs before the science of paleontology was founded. So we see accurate artwork depicting dinosaurs and allegedly extinct creatures is observed, proving that ancient people saw living dinosaurs. The evolutionary community is baffled and surprised when plants and animals assumed to have gone extinct at the same time as the dinosaurs are suddenly found to be alive. These are known as living fossils. The coelacanth comes to mind. Here's a picture of the coelacanth. The evidence. Dinosaurs have been documented in history by eyewitnesses such as Marco Polo, Herodotus, and Alexander the Great. There exists today a multitude of cave drawings, mosaics, sculptures, and paintings of dinosaurs from ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Cambodia, Europe, Australia, all over the earth. Here's a picture here that was drawn, I believe, in Utah. This picture here, Bishop Bell's dinosaur. In the 15th century, we have Bishop Bell's tomb. We know when he died, and so we know how old this is, and this is much, much before dinosaur fossils have really been found. Not until the 1800s were dinosaur fossils actually found in bulk. We find carved animals in this tomb, and some of these animals, as you've seen, look exactly like dinosaurs, sauropod dinosaurs to be exact. Many of the carved animals are animals alive today, plus dinosaurs. What more proof do you need? We know there are countless legends of lake monsters and thousands of testimonies. Was everybody lying? That's what the evolutionist is going to have to do. People clearly knew about dinosaurs. I just had to pick a few here, but there's tons. You can look at them yourselves. People have obviously always known about dinosaurs if they drew them. It's conclusive evidence, really. The evidence is clear. Man coexisting with dinosaurs is obvious after looking at the overwhelming amount of evidence. The evidence is staggering due to the endless artifacts, drawings, carvings, statues, mosaics, and depictions throughout history of various dinosaurs or other thought to be extinct animals. We look to the Bible, we hear of a behemoth who had a tail like a cedar tree. People who have to hold to that evolutionary worldview, they'll say things like behemoth was obviously a hippo or an elephant. We can go through this, but obviously where the Bible says he moves his tail like a cedar, well, if you've looked at an elephant and a hippo's tail looks nothing like a cedar. For sake of time, I'll move on here. It's all based on their worldview when people say behemoth cannot be a dinosaur. We see historical accounts, St. George killing a dragon, Beowulf, Alexander the Great. We even see it in empirical scientific evidence. Soft tissue and dino bones, new scientific findings have revealed amazingly preserved dinosaur bones which contain soft tissues, flexible blood vessels, and intact cells. This indicates these bones are thousands of years old and not millions. I mean, we see stories all around the earth. Oakley Abembe, look at that.
Yes, there is plenty of evidence that dinosaurs lived with man and even went on Noah's Ark. All you have to do is mention the word dinosaur on Noah's Ark or dinosaurs living with man in, say, recent times will lead to scoffing from the atheists, from the evolutionists. But the fact is, this evidence of dinosaurs living with man and that the Bible's history of this universe is accurate is overwhelming. There's actual historic, scientific, and even eyewitness evidence, ample evidence for this. And the fact is that more and more evidence actually continues to be discovered, which actually proves that everything we've been taught about dinosaurs is absolutely wrong. Dinosaurs have been documented in history by eyewitnesses. A few examples that come to mind are Alexander the Great, Marco Polo, Herodotus. You can look for yourself. There exists massive amounts of cave drawings, mosaics, paintings, scriptures, sculptures of dinosaurs from ancient Egypt, Cambodia, Europe, Australia, North America, pretty much all over the earth. And in the scripture, we see the description of dinosaur-like animals: Leviathan, behemoth. The word dragon is used over and over again. And these sculptures, mosaics, paintings, cave drawings that I talk about, you can actually go see them yourself. We even have documentation of the existence of completely fresh, non-fossilized dinosaur bones. What is unfortunate is that people have been brainwashed, and not only brainwashed, but conditioned to believe that these dinosaurs are actually prehistoric animals, beasts that lived until about 65 million years ago. But the fact is, these evolutionary scientists, they're dedicated to convincing you that dinosaurs lived long before man. Because what they have to do, they're like salesmen, evolutionary salesmen. They have to sell you the story, the fairy tale that comes right out of SpongeBob La La Land, that pine trees, whales, and dinosaurs are all related through common ancestry. So if dinosaurs were actually alive within the last few thousand years, this theory of evolution, pond scum to people evolution, becomes highly unlikely. Now, dinosaurs to begin with, they're nothing more than reptiles that continue to grow in size. And most people that I talk to, most people that you will talk to, they seem to be unaware of the fact that reptiles never stop growing in size while they're alive. For example, as humans, we know that our noses and ears never stop growing. And same with mammals and most of the animal kingdom. They grow to a certain size, then stop growing. While they do get older, they don't get any bigger. But with reptiles, as I've stated earlier, they continue to grow in size until the day they die. Let's take a tortoise that has lived over 100 years. It's known and documented that they get to be the size of a bathtub. Imagine a tortoise that could live up to 500 years. They'd be the size of a garage. Now, when we actually examine dinosaurs, and if we look to the biblical record of history, say before Noah's flood, we know that man lived to be hundreds of years old. Methuselah, for example, lived to be 969 years old. And after the flood, when the lifespan of man was decreased based on the after effects of the flood, based on genetic entropy, the accumulation of low impact, deleterious mutations, the ages of man have dropped off. Take that back to a point of, say, least genetic entropy. Imagine if these animals had the ability to live that long as well. We know today that reptiles never stop growing in size throughout their entire lifetime. Therefore, picture a Komodo dragon, picture a gecko. What are they going to look like after 500 years? Can you say dinosaur? Now, to not get into too much detail about the biblical evidence, let's look at the evidence of dinosaurs living with man in recent history. Because like I said earlier, it's overwhelming due to the countless artifacts, drawings, mosaics, carvings, depictions. You can see depictions of Brachiosaurus, plesiosaurs, pterodactyls, triceratops, T-Rex, and many, many more. The question is, for the evolutionists, if man didn't live with these creatures, how did artists throughout ancient history and in cultures all over the world happen to draw these animals, to recreate these giant beasts? Was it just all coincidence that it turns out that they look nearly identical to what we see in the books about dinosaurs in museums today? I've heard evolutionists say, well, they must have seen dinosaur skeletons back then too, and that's how they were able to recreate them and draw them. And it's not just a coincidence. They've seen the bones. But the thing is, this argument fails tremendously. And the reason why is that dinosaur skeletons, they're not just found lying on the ground intact, as if someone's gonna walk by, look down and see what that dinosaur looked like. The bones are always fragmented, they're separated, and they're embedded deep within the ground or within the rock. And most of them are missing. Occasionally, yes, you might find a piece of a single bone, say, sticking out of a rock here and there. But at the end of the day, that's pretty much all that we actually find. And if you actually think about this logically, what does logic say? That's all anyone in ancient history would have been able to find as well. And there's no way they would have been able to create that image of the entire animal, the entire dinosaur, without the entire skeleton. We know that the science of paleontology did not develop until the early 1800s. It's all rescue device after rescue device and post hoc, ad hoc explanations coming from the evolutionist side. This process of digging out and excavating dinosaur bones from, say, rock didn't begin until then. And as a consequence, the first complete skeleton of a dinosaur was not constructed until the 1800s. The word dinosaur, which everybody knows means, great or terrible lizard, it didn't exist before 1841. That's when it was coined. But that doesn't mean dinosaurs didn't exist. It just means that these giant animals, these reptiles, these creatures weren't called dinosaurs before 1841. This is what logic dictates. They were called dragons, and what do we see? Thousands of dragon legends from cultures all around the world. Dragon sightings have been documented and recorded throughout history by eyewitnesses. They've been part of all sorts of legends and cultures all around the earth, from China to England to everywhere. And as I said earlier, there's even over 20 references to dinosaurs in the Bible. But of course, if the word dinosaur wasn't coined until 1841, they were not called dinosaurs, they were called dragons, since the word didn't exist yet. This all fits perfectly within a biblical base model. So how did these people 2,000-3,000 years ago, how did they know almost exactly what dinosaurs look like? Listen guys, there's only two options. Either logically, they saw the dinosaurs with their own eyes, or they could have constructed the skeletons. There's not really a third logical option. That won't sound ridiculous at the end of the day. So if we actually look into these explanations, and we look at, say, civilizations throughout history, to think that they actually knew exactly what dinosaurs looked like in detail by just seeing, dinosaur skeletons, at the end of the day, that's not logical. Because as I said earlier, the first skeleton was not even put together until the 1800s. And there's not as many dinosaur skeletons as you'd think. The fossil record, we can look to paleontologist Dr. Kurt Wise. He's got a PhD in geology from Harvard University. He'll tell you, this is confirmed. This is fact that only 0.0025% of the entire fossil record consists of more than a single bone of vertebrate animals. And after nearly hundreds of years, 200 years to be exact, of paleontology, we have now been able to come up with just a few fossils of large dinosaurs. And there's almost no evidence in history of previous civilizations digging and excavating bones, let alone creating entire skeletons, as some of these evolutionary apologists would have you believe. But remember, they need to hang on to that primary assumption that pawns come to people evolution is true. At best, if you want to give them something, someone in history maybe found an occasional large bone shard, say in the ground, and tell their buddies, okay, this belonged to some type of big animal, but it's not logical at all. As a matter of fact, it's illogical to believe that they could, with their imagination, guess exactly what, say, a Tyrannosaurus or a Brachiosaurus or a Triceratops would look like, or any other dinosaurs for that matter. I could go on and on and on. Plesiosaurs, for example. How would they know that these depictions were identical to what they actually look like, the ones that we see in these artworks, the cave drawings, the sculptures, the mosaics, and writings that we can go into thoroughly throughout history and for many different cultures around the world. Usually, in what it is about legends, thousands of legends, is they come from a common source. Ask yourself, whether you're a believer, you're on the fence, or you're a critic, if these dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago before modern man evolved, and the first dinosaur skeleton was then not excavated and constructed until the early 1800s, how did human artwork throughout all of history just so perfectly manage to come out and depict several types of dinosaurs that look absolutely identical to the dinosaur depictions we see in the science books today? It's a simple answer, guys, as everything is. Start with a biblical-based model, a biblical-based assumption. What's the answer? They drew what they saw with their own eyes.
But it gets better. The Doheny expedition also documented the fascinating petroglyph of what they even labeled as a dinosaur. Hubbard commented that the photograph of the dinosaur petroglyph had been shown to a scientist of report, who then remarked, "It is not a dinosaur. It is impossible because we know that dinosaurs were extinct 12 million years before man appeared on the earth."
Since young Earth creationists reject the entirety of geologic history, they're determined to make believe that everything was magically created all at once and that dinosaurs lived alongside people, at least in the Bible times.
This is probably one of the most simple and basic evidences that dinosaurs lived with man. This is the original photo, found in Utah. The Native Americans drew it on a stone. They actually used a pecking mechanism to pound this into the rock. Anybody can look at this image and realize that it's a dinosaur. You could show it to a 5-year-old and they will recognize it as a dinosaur. It even has a face on it. You can see the mouth and eyes. When a skeptic looks at this, however, they don't see it. I don't know why, but they don't. As a matter of fact, a lot of them say no, what they were actually drawing was probably just a lizard. Well, I'm not convinced of this argument because look, you can tell they know what a lizard looks like. Here's a goat. Here are some snakes. Yet, look at this. So I believe they drew what they saw, and this video will be my theory. See, to make rock carving images, ancient natives used an object to chip away the original rock in a process called pecking, which leaves behind tiny holes or divots. In a recent report, researchers tried to discredit this interesting depiction of a dinosaur by saying the legs are not part of the image, they are not pecked or otherwise man-made, but they are stained of mud or some other light-colored material or mineral. As their sketch here shows, they maintain that what looks like a dinosaur is really just a snake glyph with a stain below it. Evolutionary biologist Phil Sinter co-authored a paper in an online journal, asserted the theropod-like image was not what it appears to be. They wrote that it is a composite of two separate petroglyphs, and that its apparent legs were created by a mud or mineral stain. They claim that this artifact is now officially discredited, which of course would be the sigh of relief news for evolutionists and dinosaur age, and bad news for the creation model of Earth's history. Fortunately, since the method used in the study was basically done just by looking at the artifact, virtually anyone can cross-check the author's observation, which is exactly what has been done, with common sense testing. But first, they lie about the lower body portion only being stained, and no peck marks making up the lower body, as peck marks extend down into the presumed body of the petroglyph, even extending down into the area where the legs are, contrary to what they tell the public. Here are some pictures of this. Daryl Robbins documented this petroglyph in the summer of 2010. The body and leg area pecking divots were obvious to Robbins, who after reading Sinter's report replied, "From my picture, it is clear that the whole dinosaur shape is chipped into the rock surface, not just a mud stain. It's pretty sad when a lowly IT guy does better scientific investigations than scientists. There is a difference between being debunked and being declared debunked. This petroglyph has not really been discredited as a dinosaur except through mass media. They know that the average person cannot access these easily without a ladder to see them for themselves, so they know that they can just get away with saying what they want and people will just believe it." Similar to what evolutionary theory has become today, belief and imagination about something that happened that is not observable or testable or repeatable. So upon a huge ledge where this petroglyph is that depicts this large dinosaur, Jan Cameron did an extensive rock art rubbing of the dinosaur image. She was commissioned by a Canadian government to do a rock art rubbing on fossils because it picked up details that the human eye cannot see. Her scientific analysis absolutely reveals that it is a dinosaur. The dinosaur image was made using a hammer, stone, and a deer antler tint. They would peck hundreds of holes to get the proper texture and create the image seen still today on these rock formations. So when someone can walk up, place a sheet of thick paper over the image and rub chalk over it and get the perfect image of a dinosaur, including using USB portable microscopes and multiple gauge tools to help verify that it is indeed what it looks like, then why believe the so-called experts who just walked up, looked at it, and wielded some story without conducting any scientific experiments. Oh, that's right, never mind, don't question them. They're the paid, true experts. Now, let's give them this and say that the image of this dinosaur is not a dinosaur, and it is a complete fraud, even though that's not true. Now we have a huge problem as well for them, because there's a second sauropod dinosaur immediately to its right of the first, with its head turned back looking at the other, and its tail going underneath the neck of the first. So now they have to discredit two dinosaurs, which they never show nor talk about in pictures, both with peck marks that are made up of their entire bodies, not stains. Stack this with the other evidence of Native American artifacts and the scientific discovery of sauropod coprolites in the area, then the evolutionary dogma of 65-million-year-old dinosaur crumbles. I urge you to return to common sense. If you want to let them sprinkle on academic stupidity dust on it and just let them lie to you and try to jam another rescuing device down your throat, trying to tell you it's anything but what it obviously is, then be my guest. But the obvious peck marks throughout, the clear visual outline, the rock art cast rubbings made, the fact that there are two dinosaurs side by side, and the many photographs taken by many different people that all show it's clearly a dinosaur by anyone who has common sense looking at these things, then I think it's pretty safe to say we don't need the indoctrinated fearmongers to come along and try to tell you it's all made up. I fear evolutionary paleontologists are highly indoctrinated, so they cannot see the obvious sometimes right in front of them. They can suffer from paranoia because the current living dinosaur is a paleontologist's nightmare. It is a smashing blow to evolutionism, which means they would have to admit what they have told everyone was wrong, what they teach is wrong, and what they believe themselves is wrong. Their cognitive dissonance will never allow it. I urge you to investigate Native American legends and artifacts depicting dinosaur-like creatures. It should leave your mind far more open to the possibility that humans depicted what they saw, because no other logical conclusion could be made as to why people worldwide made up such things. Most people have never heard of the Ashley phosphate beds of South Carolina, which is a shame because it is the best piece of evidence to ever exist currently that man has lived alongside of dinosaurs, without question. The Ashley phosphate bed is the largest graveyard ever found. This information has been forgotten by the sands of time, but I am going to bring it back. Today, the Ashley phosphate bed is mined for its high quantities of phosphate, which is being used for fertilizer, so there is great money to be made. These sedimentary layers are huge, covering large portions of the Carolinas and extending into Florida all the way up into Canada. World-famous geologist at the time, Louis Agassiz, described the phosphate beds as the greatest graveyard he had ever known. The phosphate beds are so full of bones that it is believed by scientists that the phosphate itself is made from bone. So, if the Ashley phosphate bed is loaded with such an incredible amount of fossils as to cause the leading geologist and zoologist of his day to call them the greatest graveyard he had ever known, you should ask yourself, why has zero mention of this ever been brought up? The fossils completely ravaged the evolutionary timeline. That's why. Remember, if the geologic column is out of place, even in one area on Earth, then it falsifies the theory of evolution, and that the layers formed slowly and that they represent time. Well, when you look at this one place where there's an 18-inch thick layer, you will see why it's suppressed. In it are rare fossils of everything from whales and porpoises, fish, sharks, megalodon shark, toads, crocodiles, alligators, turtles, rabbits, monkeys, horses, camels, elephants, mammoth, mastodon, rhinoceroses, giant sloth, muskrats, deer, pig, dogs, hadrosaur dinosaurs, iguanodon dinosaurs, plesiosauruses, ichthyosaurs, and human bones, teeth, and artifacts, all within the same layer. Professor S.F. Holmes, the paleontologist and curator of the College of Charleston's National History Museum, described the fossil graveyard in a report to the Academy of Natural Sciences. He stated, "Remains of the hog, the horse, and other animals of recent date, together with human bones mingled in with the bones of mastodon and extinct giant lizards." And this is on record. The occurrence of a hadrosaur dinosaur remains in the Ashley phosphate beds has not been dealt with in the secular science literature really at all. Only 2 sources exist. They have kept it silent, which is typical. The sad part is, when they first uncovered the relics of the human bone, they immediately became afraid. They, without hesitation, considered their jobs to be at a loss, so they said that the bone was out of place to one another. They immediately threw it in the river to be erased from history and hidden from all view. They knew that such a find would cause them to either probably lose their jobs or their grant funding. And this is all the way back in the late 1800s. They were still in fear of the government from evolutionary dogma, as Darwin's theory had now taken hold. The scientists who studied this knew exactly what they had found. This is why their deep concern for finding such anomalies. Professor of Geology and Paleontology F.S. Holmes believed in the conventional evolutionary sequence. So he knew full well that humans and dinosaurs should not be found in the same layer. In fact, he wrote, "Not long after finding the above-named relics of human workmanship and engaged in our usual visits to the Ashley bed, a bone was found projecting from the bluff. Immediately in contact with the surface of the stormy stratum, we pulled it out and behold, a human bone. Without hesitation, it was condemned an accidental occupant of quarters to which had no right, geologically, and so we threw it into the river. Alas, we have lived to regret our temerity and rashness. A year later, a lower jawbone with teeth was taken from the same bed, and now we have it in the cabinet." After the news became public, I guess Holmes saw no reasons to cower from his discovery anymore, as Holmes portrayed a dinosaur with a man on the cover of his own book. Evolutionists have admitted that if dinosaurs are ever found with humans, then they would admit that the Noah's flood was real and that man did live alongside of dinosaurs, and that the biblical timeline is true. Because this evidence would validate that the Earth is young and that they had been lied to about our ancient history, there is no rescuing device for them either, because the Ashley phosphate beds had no layers to them. All of the fossils are mixed together in one huge pool of bones, 18 inches thick, covering 200 miles, with no layers found anywhere. The experts who spent considerable time excavating in the phosphate beds have said that there are no layers, and not even a remote resemblance of a layer. It is all one graveyard. You can learn more about the Ashley phosphate bed in a book called Man, Dinosaur, and Mammals Together, written by the late geologist John Watson, available at Mount Blanco Fossil Museum. A statement from the book says, "Since remains of land animals and sea animals were found together, a catastrophic event would have included the burial of enormous numbers of animals, and their subsequent conversion into the rock phosphate over a region of at least 200 miles by 30 miles in extent, which is only partially exposed apart. Such an event is of the order and magnitude of the worldwide Noetic flood."
If evolution from common ancestry is not true, and some flavor of special creation of as yet unidentified kinds is true, then there would be some surface levels in a cladogram where you would accept an actual evolutionary ancestry, but there must also be subsequent levels in that twin-nested hierarchy where life forms would no longer be the same kind and wouldn't be biologically related anymore.
Evolutionists are always trying to strengthen their arguments to make evolution sound true because they have no actual physical evidence to prove that it is true, nor their ability to prove deep-time phylogenetic trees they draw are real. One such way of adding validity to their arguments is by adding different branches of science. For example, combining nucleotide variations between species, adding taxonomy, and adding physical similarities as well. But it's just a ridiculous attempt, and why it's failing them so hard. Just these 3 branches alone change all the time, because inevitably, if a biologist uses comparative anatomy, puts something in one branch, it won't take long before a taxonomist moves it to another. It just shows the inadequacy of the entire program. Imagine if all of the different branches of science had their input into helping build these trees. What a disaster that would be. Let me give you an example of how much of a mess it would be if we built one of these trees using multiple different branches of science. Let's take the skunk, for example, and compare it to a human. Well, we have similar solitary lives until we find a mate, and so do skunks. So a scientist would toss them on a related branch on the phylogenetic tree. But then a geneticist would come along and notice that the skunk is not similar to us in the fact that they have 50 chromosomes and humans have 46, so we would get removed from that branch. But then an anatomist would come along and notice that skunks have body hair and so do humans, so they would add us back in on that branch. But then a taxonomist would come along and would remove the skunk again from the tree branch because we are not in the order of Carnivora. Then an ethologist would come along who notices that they are active all year around and so are humans, so they would add us back into that branch. But then a zoologist who notices that they have an anal scent gland which is used for a defensive weapon, but humans don't have such a thing, so they would move us away from that branch. But along comes a statistician who notices that they are found in most states, just like people, so they would move us back into that tree branch. But then a kinesiologist would notice that our body movements are not very similar, so they again would remove the skunk from this tree branch. But then a homologist would notice that they all look the same, just like newborn babies, moving them back into the branch. But then a pathologist would notice that skunks carry spreadable infectious disease like rabies, but humans do not, so they would get removed again from the branch. But then a mammologist would say skunks are mammals, and so are humans, so they would put them back into the branch again. But then a linguist would notice that a skunk doesn't have anything beyond a basic communication skills, never producing language, so again they would be removed from the tree branch. But then comes along an anthrozoologist who notices they don't go into hibernation, just like humans, so they would be back added into the branch. Do you see where this nonsense is going? The more you investigate, the more phylogeny breaks down. This is why the current college books that teach evolution, like Tree Thinking or Evolution 101, have failed miserably at this. Of the 49 Tree of Life drawings in Evolution 101, not a single tree, 0%, includes the name of a single common ancestor, let alone even explain how the first male and female had to arise at the same time. Their explanatory power comes in the form of storytelling. Our model is far superior, and the more we investigate the small things, the more profound this becomes. Just look at the vast physiological differences between us and primates. But if that's not good enough, then listen to what a forensic investigator has to say just about hair, and just how different ours is, and different from any primate on Earth, even our supposed closest ancestor, the chimp.
Having taught forensic science for many years, as well as worked in a crime scene unit, I'm really interested in those properties that make us unique, especially which distinguish humans from other things that we see in God's creation. Well, we're going to be looking at forensic hair analysis and the distinct differences between human hair and properties that we see in animal fur. We're going to look at the 3 basic parts of an individual hair, and that is the medulla, the cortex, and the cuticle. All right, the cuticle is that outside protective coating that does make your hair waterproof, and it has other features like that because God's pretty smart. He thinks about that. All right, our cortex is where we do find our cells and our melanin color, and then in here is something we call the medulla, and it's basically what they call an airspace. But here is where we find something very important that we can look at under the microscope and distinguish between animal kinds. There are 3 basic medulla patterns, all right, and that is continuous. Now in a continuous pattern, we see this solid black line running up through the center right here. all right? In a fragmented medulla pattern, all right, we can see where it's actually broken. It's almost like Morse code. It actually looks like dots and dashes running up the center of the hair shaft. And then some people actually have what we call absent, all right, where you literally just don't see a pattern in the medulla at all. Sometimes you'll see a hair sample that looks like this, where the medulla is a little more present, but you still don't see a distinct continuous or fragmented pattern running up the center of the hair shaft. Now these are all human hairs that you see here. What we're going to find though when we go look at animals, it is distinctly different. All right, another reason that we use hair, and the primary reason we would use it in forensics, is because it has the potential to provide that unique identity, all right? So one important distinction I like to make is, especially in the presentations that I give here at the museum, is that we find hair in humans, right? We are made in the image of God, and we are distinctly different than the other creations that do have what I like to say is fur, all right? So we do find fur in animals, and we do find hair in humans, and we're going to see there are distinct differences between those two as we move through the presentation today. So what we would hope to get from finding a hair sample is that DNA fingerprint that we call it, being able to find viable DNA, and we would refer to that as nuclear DNA, which is found in the nucleus of a human cell. We can also determine hair color very quickly. We can even roughly get an idea of someone's, what we say, ethnicity or people group from that hair sample. So we need to talk just a little bit about the distinct differences between human hair and animal fur, all right? Because evolutionists like to say, well, because we share these traits with animals, it's part of that evidence they like to call that we've descended from a common ancestor. And that is just not the case, all right? God equipped us each with exactly what we needed to survive in our environment. So if we take a look at human hair versus animal fur, one thing we're going to see a difference in is growth. In humans, as I said, our hair is continuous and it is independent, meaning it's all over our head at different times and at different stages. Whereas in animal fur, it is stopped and it is synchronized, all right? Especially in animals, if we notice in the winter, especially when it's up in the areas where it's colder, they're going to get much thicker, right, in their fur. Then in the spring, what happens is they start to shed, right? You start to get fur, especially my cat sheds in the spring. I get cat fur all over my house because he is shedding that. And they do stop. Their hair does stop growing at very distinct stages. I mean, does a cow need to go to the hair salon? No, right? God equipped them to have their hair stop at a very specific point. Also, diameter. In humans, on average, the diameter or the thickness, we would say, of our hair is much thinner than we are going to see in animals. Also, our medulla patterns are thinner. And we're going to see this when we look at our pictures here in just a second, that animals have a much wider and more prominent, we would say, medulla. And as far as our texture in humans, on average, you know, our hair is soft and has the potential to grow very long. But in animals, it is coarse and often very short. Right? Now, there are rare exceptions because we have purposely crossed certain traits, especially of dogs, to have long hair. But that is not how they would normally exist in nature. Also, temperature regulation. In humans, our hair provides us absolutely no temperature regulation whatsoever. All right. In the winter, does your arm hair keep you warm, Mr. Patterson?
Not really.
No.
I usually have to put on a jacket or something.
Does our head hair keep us warm in the winter?
It does, yeah, because it's a lot thicker, but it's
But what do we have to put on if it's snowing?
We've got to put on a cap if that cold, because it's still a little thin and things can penetrate through
Right,
there.
so in the winter you still have to put on that hat, right? Because it is not going to keep you warm. Your leg hair is not going to keep you warm, right? But what about animals? Absolutely, right? God designed them to thicken up in the winter, thin out in the summer when it's warmer, and their fur is specifically designed to regulate their body temperature and allow them to live outside. And color is another distinct difference. In humans, on average, we have constant hair color, all right? That's not to say we may be lighter brown in the front or darker brown in the back, and we do get gray because our cells die, our color, we just don't produce color anymore. But on average, it's constant, right? You're never going to see a human with naturally growing zebra stripes, right, in their hair patterns. You're never going to see a human who has, like a cow, black, and brown and mustard color splotches. God just didn't create us that way. Our hair is a constant color. But in animals, you can absolutely have abrupt color change, sometimes within the same fur sample. Very distinct differences. Now, the FBI even recognizes that human hair is distinctly different. They say in human hairs, the scales form an imbricate pattern. This characteristic serves to distinguish human hairs from animal hairs. Many animal hairs have a very regular repeating pattern to their scales. So even the FBI on their website had to acknowledge that human hair is distinctly different from animal fur. And that's exactly what we'd expect to see because we are made in the image of God. So we're going to take a look at a few samples now, all right, of animals and humans side by side. So this first example is a primate sample, four different samples of primate for our next two samples of human hair. Remember we said human hair, their medulla pattern is thinner, and we can see that in evidenced here. Remember the medulla is this pattern that we have running up the center of the hair shaft here. Now if you take a look, you're going to see the distinct difference between human and animals, all right? If we look at the medulla pattern of this primate right here, this pattern running up the center, looks distinctly different from human hair, all right? Primate fur is distinctly different from human hair. There are no similarities at all in their medulla patterns. Very important.
Everything they have to prove that evolution is true breaks down when put under the microscope and when put to the test. Taxonomic classifications don't actually prove anything, but kids don't know this. This is where the beginning of deceit takes place and indoctrination begins. What most people don't know is that taxonomists also have a problem of their own. It is called taxonomic boundary paradox. The concept for a taxon today is that it can overlap in the past, according to evolution theory that they now believe in. This is why taxonomists are constantly moving and placing things in these different tree branches. But originally, this was not a problem for taxonomy, as it was invented by a Christian creationist who stated that animal families were fixed. Just like Darwin divided up humans into different races, evolutionists have now come along and called man an ape. They call us by a higher taxonomic rank because they know it is a way to sway a child's mind. Carl Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, believed that he was God's chosen instrument for revealing in a precise way the divinely ordered work of creation. As a creationist, he initially shared the then prevalent view that each species had originally been specially created by God. In his book, he wrote, "There are as many species as the infinite being produced diverse forms in the beginning." Here's a cool fact. Linnaeus did not believe in evolution, just variation within major groups, which is what creationists accept today. In his lifetime, he was called the second Adam, because the first Adam named all the animals, and Linnaeus came along and renamed them in Latin. He classified mankind, humans, as Homo sapiens, and placed us in the genus Homo in 1758 as the only member of that species, a totally separate kind, because the Latin noun homo means human being. However, he had to place humans somewhere. So he placed them into the class quadrupeds, along with apes and sloth, and in 1740, Linnaeus added anteaters to this group. What made Linnaeus link humans to nature was only one thing, and that was the female trait of living birth and the suckling of the young. While what separates humans from their co-inhabitants of the class of primate and the order of mammals was the soul and the mind, indicated in the motto for humans and the specific name he gave them, Homo sapiens, which means to know thyself, in his 3rd edition. But we know today what the truth is. Gene sequencing has shown that humans are nearly all identical to one another, no matter how far back you go in time. It doesn't matter if you're looking at Neanderthal or Denisovan or where in the world you go to test people alive today. We are all related, contrary to what evolution predicted and taught to the public. If people ever ask what makes humans different from apes, make sure to give them the list that I provide for you with this video. So the next time some idiot says, "We are just apes," tell them, "Prove it. I dare you. Go have sex with an ape and record it and give it to the police. And when you get arrested for bestiality, which is sex with an animal, stand in front of the judge and use that "We're just apes" argument and see how well that goes for you. I dare you. So in closing, taxonomy was first invented by a Christian creationist. So we own the hierarchies that evolution tries to use against us today. When taxonomy was adapted by evolutionists, it became an immediate paradox called the taxonomic boundary paradox, because things that were once set with boundaries now overlap going back into the past. Thus, classification breaks down going back in time. So they have to climb down the evolutionary tree of classification in an attempt to show relation, hoping that nobody notices taxonomy has been abused. Until we eventually get retarded arguments like, "Are you a eukaryote?" implying that if we are eukaryotes, then we must also be everything in between the first eukaryotic organism and humans today. Stupidity really knows no bounds when dealing with someone who hates an alternative model that refutes their own. Taxonomy is subjective, and it can change at any moment, at any time, for any reason, as seen fit by the taxonomist. And a final reminder, taxonomy proves nothing. They use it as proof, but it is not proof. It is a play on words used today as proof by those who have no good evidence. So evolutionists are always trying to make sure that everything is related, and wanted to classify man as an ape. So they came up with a way to linguistically smuggle mankind into the ape family. A scientist clipped together 5 physical features that humans share in common with apes to swindle man into that family. Basically, they played a language game. Just like the United States Post Office has systems for naming states, including 2-letter abbreviations, they will change the system if it suits them. At one time, the state abbreviation for Massachusetts was MASS, and for California, it was CALIF. Now it is reduced to just CA, or MA. And they can do this with anything. They can do this with taxonomy. I can do it with a raccoon, and show similarities between us and them. But what is funny to me is that these 5 things that we share in common are actually vastly different when we look into detail. Let's look at them, shall we? Marx, in 2009, said, "Apes are something that have no tail, a fused tailbone vertebrae, a large brain, and a rotating shoulder." Well, let's actually look at these things in detail. Our jaw is parabolic in shape. Not a single primate is. So now, you can see, even right out of the gate, the first similarity, when scrutinized, is very different. Next, can our shoulder rotate? Sure, obviously. But here's the thing. When we investigate this, we find that the human shoulder blades are actually unique to humans, having a combination of better lateral orientation and scapular blade shape. So now 2 things out of 5 actually show we are vastly different when we investigate them rather than just overall glaze over them at a glance. But let's go on. Is our brain larger, like in other apes? Yes, but our brain is actually much larger than all other apes, with multiple different neurons found in no other primate. For example, humans have the rosehip neurons. No ape has this. Not to mention the orphan genes that are highly expressed in the brain of humans, but not in primates. So again, even the smallest bit of investigation, when taken, looking at these similarities, we can see huge differences. I could go on down the list, showing you the differences between us and them, and the list would put you to sleep. But they put blinders on and only focus on the overall basic physical feature similarities so that they could swindle to the public and kids with wordplay. First of all, apes are not a clade. Ape is an English word. It is not a taxonomic term. English words do not need to be monophyletic. French, German, Russian, and other languages do not have to accord with English in the ways of splitting up animals. Taxonomy is international. Everywhere worldwide, we recognize human beings as part of mankind, not apes. In France, apes are called singes, and so are monkeys. In English, we differentiate these 2 terms, but in both languages, humans are different from other primates. Does that make French right and English wrong? Does that make both languages wrong? No, it means that colloquial languages have no problem describing paraphyletic groups. It is useful to have languages that can make these distinctions. So if we must accept that humans are apes, then we must equally accept that chimpanzees are monkeys. And these ignorant people at the zoo who are pointing at apes and calling them monkeys are actually right, and I don't accept that. Just like I don't accept that people point at humans and say, look at the ape. That is stupid. I see value in portraying the truth and precision about phylogeny, and for that purpose I have taxonomic terms, and I will not allow it to be including humans as apes. People are eukaryotic mammal humans, known as mankind, not apes. A child can tell the difference, but adult biologists who believe in evolution cannot. This is the twilight zone world that we live in today, where common sense is left on the floor for the next scientific fact they tell the public. We shouldn't smuggle taxonomic principles into everyday language to make a political argument, and that is what humans are apes ultimately is. It is an argument that we aren't as great as we actually are. Cladistic terminology is controlled by taxonomists, people who often shift their ideas as much as political opinion does. I'm promoting the idea that we use taxonomy for what its intended purpose is, not to insist that English do the job instead. We aren't apes, and it's okay to tell your children that chimpanzees and gorillas are apes, not monkeys, because that is what is true and honest. Humans are part of mankind, not the ape kind. The classification of humans as great apes is also dependent on historical contingency. Remember, we have no existent sister taxa. In the not-so-distant past, humans shared the planet with other races of humans that are now gone. We know them as Neanderthal and Denisovan. The secular camp believes these are ancient ancestors to humans, but that they were still humans. This means that from what we know about genetics going back over 100% of our species' existence, we have shared Earth with only other humans. There is no other proof of a missing link inside of our DNA. If one or more of these other humans had survived into contemporary times, our taxonomic classification scheme for humans would probably look much different. Instead of focusing on the similarities between humans and chimpanzees, or humans and gorillas, we would likely shift our attention to focusing more on the similarities between other humans that evolution believers think are primitive humans in our own family tree. But it's nonsense for taxonomists to lump humans in with great apes. The differences are far too striking. This is why they choose simplistic, vague similarities to call us apes and force us into that cladistic category. Splitting humans from great apes allows us to reconceptualize our own humanity. It would even force the secular camp to acknowledge just how different we really are. They would be forced to see the differences and not just the few similarities. Don't be fooled by political lies with motives behind it intended to push nonsense.
At that point, they would be magically created separate kinds and distinctly unique from those listed around it, as well as those apparently ancestral to it. So creationists have to show at least a handful of these Barrowmans and show how we can distinguish them from their parent categories. This is the phylogeny challenge, the most damning argument there is against creationism, and no creationist can meet that challenge because they know this mystic boundary they allude to isn't really there. They made it up in an attempt to deny an abundantly evident reality.
What is he talking about? Clearly he knows nothing about Barrowmanology, nor has ever even studied it for a single day, because it directly answers what a created kind is. They even have their own names in Barrowmanology called Holobarrowmans. Aron should be embarrassed to make such a blatant, ignorant statement. He has been at this for decades, and I am fairly new to this, and I know. So let's dig into some Barrowmanology, shall we? We are trying to determine what is related and what is not. So, one of the ways of doing this is by looking at current species. We take a look around at, let's say, living bears, for example. Now, how many physical features and physical traits do they share? Let's say, for sake of argument, they share all but 10. Now, if we go back into the past and we look at what we believe are extinct bears, or what we might think is a bear, what would we expect to find if they're related? Well, if we see any fossils that are outside of this 10, then the program used in bearmanology will identify it and place it outside of the species, or the family level, depending on how many differences there are. The more differences, the greater the distance. So if something has, let's say, 11 differences, then it will show up to be extremely close and perhaps related to that ancestor. But when we find close groupings and then major differences, then these are considered related kinds. One thing that you would expect from known transitionals is they would fit somewhere in between, but they do not. Bearmanology today uses bearmanologic distance correlation, multi-dimensional scaling, and principal component analysis. Then they apply it to 18-character matrices to multiple diverse species, and yes, even hominids, to determine what was the original created kind, known as holobaramins in bearmanology. So, when looking at hominidia, testing in bearmanology consisted of 12 different taxa with 186 characters. These are physical features that we can use to determine how similar something is. And after filtering at 0.8 character relevance cutoff, with 15 characters to calculate bearmanitic distances, this means that there are more than 15 differences between what is related and what is not. If something shares any less, then they would fall within the same species. This is known as positive correlation, where there is a lot of similarity or good conformity. Squares represent positive correlation. Circles are discontinuities. The goal of bearmanology is to find a group that is discontinuous, that is spread out from every other group, but within it is extremely high continuity. This is identifying what a created kind is. So when we find, let's say, a box with many different species in it, they are related from a single kind within that species at creation, or from the species that was on the ark if you're looking at living species alive today. Finding boxes is not what one would expect to see if evolution were true, but is exactly what we should expect to find based on what young Earth creation predicted if things were created. If all that is not bad enough for evolution now, back in 2018 they discovered that there are genetic boundaries, and even the scientists themselves, after they discovered that all life was the same age, relented by stating that they fought against this data as hard as they could. One even went as far to say, although it is easy to imagine that humans passed through a bottleneck 170,000 years ago, it's hard to believe that exactly the same thing happened in all species. Did herrings really pass through an equally recent bottleneck? Anchovies too? Do you notice a problem? They are so confused that all life, including aquatic life, all went through a global bottleneck. Of course, they think this happened around 200,000 years ago, but that's just their mindset. That's just their indoctrination. The fact that even in their own model, a global bottleneck happened at all, even in 200,000 years ago, is shocking to them. They didn't expect it, they didn't predict it, and the genetic evidence says it's right there. Aron wouldn't know this because he doesn't keep up on the science whatsoever. And he obviously doesn't look at any conflicting evidence, because he is the epitome of confirmation bias.
Who is the fraud? Who is the fraudster?
Aron Ra proposes what is called the phylogeny challenge. Aron Ra is clearly not up to date with the scientific data that confirms separate ancestry. Aron proposes that all life is related through common ancestry. That's right. Aron believes banana plants and whales are related, and he even calls this science. We have genetic related data that confirms separate ancestry and refutes Aron's ancestry related challenges. Using mitochondrial DNA, we can trace migration patterns. We can determine ancestry. And we can answer some remarkably interesting questions pertaining to our origins. Firstly, mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from the mother's side. And we know that the majority of DNA differences in the mitochondrial DNA have to be due to mutation. The evolutionists assume that the ultimate source of genetic variation is mutations over time, while creationists propose the created heterozygosity hypothesis. Now, one thing we can do through the uniparentally inherited DNA compartments like the mitochondrial DNA here is we can trace time. For example, when did these DNA differences arise? Since both creationists and evolutionists can agree that these DNA differences are the result of mutations over time, these DNA compartments, the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, are the best to look at to determine ancestry. Because evolutionists, as I've stated, assume that the vast majority of nuclear DNA differences are the result of mutations, while creationists invoke design diversity. Now, going back to the mitochondrial DNA, are the number of DNA differences in this DNA compartment of humans more consistent with universal common ancestry or separate ancestry? When we use the empirical method to measure the rate as to which the DNA changes in this DNA compartment, we find that the rate is fast, much faster than the evolutionary community had ever predicted. The mutation rate in the mitochondrial DNA demonstrates that the mother of us all, Eve, lived just thousands of years ago. This data both confirms separate ancestry and refutes universal ancestry. This data essentially refutes Aron Ra's challenges concerning ancestry. No, banana plants and whales are not related through common ancestry. In the mitochondrial DNA, there are far too few DNA differences in the world. Evolutionists attempt to put mitochondrial Eve hundreds of thousands of years ago. And that is just not what we find. We have scientific evidence confirming the biblical Eve. And the evolutionists have been incapable of refuting this data. Mitochondrial DNA trees, for example, grow in branching-like patterns. We can literally reverse the clock back to the point where we would find Eve. We know Eve would have had children, and her children would have had children. Every time a child is born, there is then a chance that the child would have a mutation. A mutation is a copying error. Now, every time a mutation happens, the result would be a new branch on the family tree. Over time, the family tree gains more and more branches due to these copying errors. We can then back this process up to where we eventually find the woman of whom we have all descended from. I also want to point out the fact that we can count the number of mutations found in people today. All we really find is about 20 to 30 mutations that separate most people in the world today from our Eve ancestor. It is extremely easy to account for the amount of DNA differences in the mitochondrial DNA, especially when we start from Eve just 6,000 years ago. The data does not fit deep time evolution and universal common ancestry. What we see is evidence for one woman. There are far too few mutations. We have a fast mutation rate and a pattern that is expected if the biblical model of ancestry were true. The other uniparentally inherited DNA compartment is the Y chromosome. And even the Y chromosome has extremely low variation. Every single male Y chromosome on the planet is nearly identical. The Y chromosome, just like the mitochondrial DNA, is also fast. It picks up about one mutation every generation, and there are only a few hundred mutations separating people worldwide. And our last Y chromosomal ancestor, being Noah, existed just 4,500 years ago. This is all inconsistent with universal common ancestry. And so we have the mitochondrial DNA in humans that's nothing like the chimpanzee mitochondrial DNA. And we also have the Y chromosome that is incredibly different between humans and chimpanzees. When we consider overall architecture, gene content, and size differences, our Y chromosome is less than 35% dissimilar to the chimpanzee Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is non-recombining DNA. It should be relatively stable. And yet we see a highly divergent Y chromosome. How does Aron Ra explain this massive problem for his model of ancestry? Another amazing line of evidence that refutes Aron Ra's position of universal common ancestry has to do with the structure of human chromosomes. Human chromosomes are made up of relatively large linkage blocks. And it turns out that analyses of these original text strings tells us what? It tells us that the genome is young. And the reason is because the genome has only been partially scrambled. Crossovers and gene conversions should scramble all linkage blocks quite quickly in an evolutionary time frame. This is a major problem for evolutionary theory. And how does Aron Ra explain this data?
Shut up!
We've also got recent data that confirms genetic boundaries in species. Aron Ra asks, where are the boundaries in ancestry? There's no evidence for biblical kinds, and yet we have this data that suggests over 90% of all species today have originated at the same time. This is all perfectly consistent with the biblical model of ancestry and vastly inconsistent with universal ancestry. Aron Ra might say the created heterozygosity hypothesis is just a post hoc argument, when in fact, the design diversity hypothesis makes testable predictions, many of them being confirmed. Evolutionists have assumed lots of evolutionary leftovers, junk DNA, and genomic fossils. And this is because of their starting point. Remember, they assume that the ultimate source of genetic variation is mutations. Evolutionists have assumed millions of years of unguided and unintelligent evolutionary change. And that's why they expect so much junk and so much evolutionary leftovers. But we as biblical creationists, we would expect, based on the created heterozygosity hypothesis, genomes of treasure. We would predict function, while evolutionists mostly predict non-function. And it turns out we have preliminary evidence for genome-wide functionality. We can also safely predict that much of the genome is involved in embryological development. We have windows of development that consist of incredible growth. The trajectory of discovery strongly favors biblical creation and once again refutes universal ancestry. The entire junk DNA paradigm has been overturned. This also includes many of the so-called greatest lines of evidence for universal ancestry, which assume junk DNA. For example, we now know that pseudogenes, ERVs, ALU sequences, and other types of genomic fossils are highly functional and active and necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. Even the chromosome 2 fusion has been completely overturned. Another amazing line of evidence that confirms the design diversity hypothesis is the epigenome. We have this entire additional layer of complexity and functional information that evolutionary mechanisms cannot account for. The epigenome controls how the genes make the physical parts of our cells, and this extra layer of amazing information helps turn genes on and off, and not change the actual genetic code itself. Our genes are not all turned on at the same time. This would not be good. These are non-random changes. Good design, as we know, means we need to have some type of control, a type of control that makes sure we have the right things being turned on and the right things being turned off. This is all forward thinking, which points us back to the forward thinker. The forward thinker that Aron Ra wants to reject. How do evolutionary processes design that which requires forward thinking? Will Aron Ra propose that evolutionary mechanisms have a mind? Remember, Aron Ra assumes that the ultimate source of genetic variation and the originator of these DNA differences are mutations. Well, from one generation to the next, many mutations are passed on, roughly 100 new mutations per person per generation. We are consistently more mutant than our parents. As a matter of fact, we are all multiply mutant, which is why selection is limited. This is 100 typographical errors every generation that our parents did not have. Natural selection must remove or filter out these mutations, or else we will go extinct. Mutations in general put shelf lives on genomes, which is why Aron Ra does not have deep time. Banana plants and whales are not related. Most mutations are nearly neutral and only slightly deleterious. These low-impact mutations are only slightly harmful to the point where they do not really affect reproduction. Selection cannot see these. These low-impact deleterious mutations, these nearly neutral mutations, are invisible to selection. And therefore, what type of selection can Aron Ra present us with that can remove that which is invisible? This evidence suggests that species are going downhill. And Aron Ra, once again, does not have millions of years of evolutionary advancement. Remember, time is the god. Time is the hero of the plot for Aron Ra. But Aron Ra does not have the time, and even with the time, based on what we know of low-impact deleterious mutation accumulation, more time equals more extinction, more degeneration, not large-scale evolution. We also see a perfect biological decay curve that matches the biblical model of longer lives closer to the creation. We see that it drops off significantly after the flood. This data has almost no chance at being coincidence. This is an amazing correlation between what we know about mutation accumulation, genetic degeneration, and biblical longevity. It makes absolutely no sense that the biblical authors would ever make this up. Also, fabricating this biological decay curve would require exceptional knowledge in statistics and mathematics. The systematic degeneration of man, as documented in the Bible, is extremely consistent with genetic entropy and deleterious mutation. The Genesis biological decay curve reflects real biology. Now, Aron Ra argues all day that dogs and cats are apparently related simply because they are both carnivores and also mammals, and therefore they are also related to bears, since bears are also carnivores, and in many ways share numerous features in terms of morphology, anatomy, physiology, and genetics with both dogs and cats. But this does not help Aron Ra, because the data suggests separate ancestry. Aron Ra needs to demonstrate that dogs, cats, bears, and banana plants are related. He has not done that. Actually, the genetic data refutes that idea.
Many of the people watching this video won't care about anything I've said here. They'll object to and reject most of it because polls show that nearly half of Americans believe that the universe is younger than this sponge. And they believe in Noah's flood, even though none of that nonsense could withstand even a moment of critical examination or logical thought.
The survey said...
Historical genealogies, harmful genetic mutations, writing systems, mathematics, civilizations, all of these are documented at a rising 5,000 years ago. How? Why? It should be obvious. But yet, they want us to believe that humans waited 195,000 years to figure out all the same things at exactly the same time worldwide. Give me a break. They must think we are all so gullible if we're all just going to believe that nonsense. The oldest trees date right back to this time as well. Helium diffusion rates, right back to then. Mutation rates, right back to them. Magnetic decay rates, speciation rates, thermoluminescence dating, coral growth rates, racemization rates, underground oil pressure, including the recently discovered cold subducted slabs under Earth's crust that can only be there if the global flood is true and it occurred recently. All of these just so happen to date right back to that same time period. That's far beyond coincidence. The probability of all these things lining up validates that the flood account is true and that it occurred recently. The only thing left for evolutionists to argue that the Earth is old is radiometric dating. And since it cannot get the dates of known ages correct, what makes us believe that it's reliable for rocks of unknown ages correct? Clearly, it is not only unreliable, but the fact that we know today that super heavy elements rapidly decay into stable radiometric isotopes that date millions or billions of years old, even though they were just formed, proves that radiometric dating is no longer evidence for evolution or anything else for that matter. It doesn't matter how consistent their decay rates become after it cools, because the early stages of their formation have shown us that they actually form rapidly from super heavy elements through the process of Z-pinch, where these elements are quickly fissioned and decay into subatomic particles, isotopes, and radioactive elements. Not only that, when they do form, they form in the arrangement of elements that matches exactly what we find on Earth's crust today, observed at the Proton 21 laboratories in Ukraine. Evolutionists claim that the Earth's radioactive elements came from material that evolved inside a star that exploded and the debris later formed to create Earth. But now we know stars cannot create any element above iron, so how could their theory be true? It can't. Evolution has been dealt its death blow regarding radiometric dating. And if all that's not bad enough, if evolution were true, then why, when it comes to medicine, does the National Institute of Health use the young Earth creation model of Mendel's accountant, a young Earth creationist model designed by Dr. John Sanford? Clearly, when it comes to health, the largest biomedical research company in the world doesn't care about creation versus evolution debate. They just care about what works and what's true, because they need to heal people. And they choose the young Earth creation evidence, not evolution, because they know the truth. Evolution is a lie.
I spend more time pretending to be learned than actually learning, and I would, yeah.
If you like this type of content, be sure to hit subscribe and also smash that like button. It actually does help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.